There are things in this world that resist explanation, things that were never meant to be fully understood, and the province of Skyrim holds more of them than most places care to admit. These are the questions the scholars write around rather than through, the silences that linger in books after the ink has dried. Before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Some of these mysteries have been studied for centuries within the lore of Tamriel. Others have barely been named. All of them share something in common. They refuse to close. There is a place in the Reach, in the jagged western highlands, where the stone rises sharply and the wind moves differently than it does anywhere else in Skyrim, where the ruins of a civilization called the Dwemer still stand with a patience that borders on the eerie. The automatons still move through those corridors. The steam still drifts from pipes that have been running for longer than most mortal nations have existed. And at the center of everything the Dwemer left behind is a question so enormous and so deliberately unanswered that even the most sophisticated in-universe scholarship treats it with something close to reverence. Where did they go? Not how they were destroyed, not what war they lost, not which plague undid them. Where did they go? Because whatever happened to the Dwemer, it was not destruction in any ordinary sense. The Dwemer were among the oldest of the Elven peoples, and they were unlike every other branch of that long-lived family in ways that went far deeper than architecture or craft. While the Altmer built their culture around a devotion to the divine ancestry of elven kind, and while the Dunmer shaped their spiritual lives around the complex relationships between mortals and the beings they called the Tribunal and the Reclamations, the Dwemer built their entire philosophical foundation on a rejection of the divine as a category that deserved reverence. This was not casual skepticism. It was systematic, thorough, and informed by centuries of study that the Dwemer directed not away from the gods, but directly toward them. They looked at the divine the way a craftsman looks at a mechanism, with the specific intention of understanding it well enough to improve it. Their cities reflect this. The deep halls beneath Markarth, the vast underground networks accessible through ruins scattered across the Reach and beyond, were not built as places to hide from the world above. They were built as controlled environments, places where the Dwemer could work without the interference of weather or politics or the unpredictable currents of the surface world pressing in on their concentration. The scale of what they built is still almost incomprehensible when you walk through those spaces today. Ceilings so high they disappear into shadow. Pipes that carry heated water through stone channels engineered with a precision that nothing built since has quite matched. Homunculi, the brass and copper constructs they programmed to carry out tasks indefinitely, still performing those tasks thousands of years after the hands that built them ceased to exist. The Dwemer built things to last, which makes the sudden and total nature of their disappearance all the stranger. In the late First Era, in the year that the records mark as 1 Era 700, every Dwemer on the face of Nirn vanished, not gradually, not in stages, or across different regions at different times. Every single one of them, simultaneously, regardless of where they were standing or what they were doing. The scholar Marabadur of Wayrest documented accounts of the moments immediately following what he called the sudden silence, and the descriptions he gathered share a quality that is difficult to fully absorb. Meals left on tables still warm, books left open to pages in the middle of argument, tools set down mid-task, and the automata still moving, still grinding, still following instructions from hands that were no longer there to give new ones. The Dwemer did not flee. They did not die in any form that left bodies behind. They were simply absent where they had been present with nothing in between. The event that is most widely associated with this disappearance is something that occurred at a place called Red Mountain, deep in the volcanic interior of Vardenfell in what is now Morrowind. Beneath that mountain, the Dwemer had discovered something that their texts describe, in terms that shift between scientific analysis and a kind of barely contained awe. They called it the Heart of Lorcan, and the creation mythology of several cultures across Tamriel identifies Lorcan as the divine being responsible for bringing the mortal world into existence. The precise nature of Lorcan varies significantly between traditions. Some describe him as a trickster who deceived the other divine forces into sacrificing their immortality to create a physical world they had not consented to make. Others describe him as a visionary whose plan was sound but whose methods were brutal. What all of the traditions agree on is that the other divine forces were not pleased, and that as punishment, they stripped Lorcan of his divine heart, which fell to the earth and buried itself beneath Red Mountain, still pulsing with something that had no proper name in any mortal language. The Dwemer tonal architect Kagranak designed a series of tools, objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, named Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard, specifically engineered to interact with the heart in a controlled manner. The goal, as far as scholars have been able to reconstruct it from fragmentary texts, was to use the divine energy of the heart to power a massive construct called the Numidium, a brass golem of enormous scale that Kagranak intended as a kind of engine for his people's ascension. Exactly what form that ascension was meant to take remains genuinely unclear. The texts leave deliberate space around the answer, the way you might leave space around something too bright to look at directly. Whether the Dwemer intended to become divine themselves, to transcend mortality entirely, or to achieve something that had no prior precedent in Tamrielic history, is a question that the game does not answer, and the lore circles around carefully for good reason. What is known is that on the day Kagranak struck the heart with his tools, every Dwemer disappeared, and the Numidium, unpowered, incomplete, fell silent too. The construct itself would become its own thread in the mystery, surfacing at various points in later history, sought by powers that understood only fragments of what it was and what had been intended for it. But the Dwemer who had built it were simply gone, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the automata they had programmed to maintain their cities could not fill it. There is something about that particular kind of abandonment, the absence that comes not from departure but from disappearance, that the Dwemer ruins still carry in the quality of their quiet. A different kind of quiet than emptiness, a quiet that feels as though it is still waiting for something. The last living Dwemer, a figure named Yagrum Bagarn, provides the closest thing to testimony available on the question of what the disappearance felt like from within. Yagrum survived because he was traveling in oblivion at the time of the event, exploring the plains of the Daedric princes, which placed him outside whatever sphere of effect the experiment created. He returned to find his people gone and his own body beginning to deteriorate without the societal structures and medical knowledge of his civilization to maintain it. By the time of Morrowind, the game in which he appears, he is enormously bloated, suffering from a disease called corpus, kept alive through the care of a reclusive scholar in a place accessible only to those who have already been infected themselves. He speaks with the measured sadness of someone who has had centuries to come to terms with a loss that can never be fully processed. He does not know what happened to his people. He has had a very long time to not know. There are theories, of course. The most prevalent one, supported by in-game scholarship and by the way the event is described in texts from multiple cultures, is that Kagranak's experiment succeeded in a way that was either misunderstood or that carried consequences he had not anticipated. The souls of every Dwemer may have been absorbed into the heart simultaneously, not destroyed, but transformed into something that exists in a category beyond mortal comprehension, not dead, not alive in any conventional sense, woven into the divine substrate of the world itself, present in the way that ancient things are present, in the deep resonance of stone, in the particular quality of silence in spaces that have held too much history to be simply empty. The Dwemer, by this reading, are not gone. They are elsewhere in a manner that has no adequate description. The question that no text can resolve is whether that was what they intended, and whether, from wherever they are now, it resembles anything they recognized as success. There is a second mystery that the Dwemer ruins carry inside them, quieter than the question of where the Dwemer went, but perhaps more persistent in the way it surfaces in the mind during the long hours of exploration. The automatons they left behind still move. They still maintain the temperature of those underground corridors. They still respond to intrusion with the defensive protocols they were programmed with so long ago. This is remarkable on its own, because these are mechanisms without any living hand to tend them, still functioning across what the calendar marks as thousands of years. But the deeper question is what that continued functioning means. Did Kagranak program them to run indefinitely? Did some residual energy from the experiment sustain them? Or is there something about the Dwemer understanding of what they called tonal architecture, the manipulation of the fundamental vibrations that underlie all physical reality, that allows mechanisms to persist beyond the lifespan of any normal engineering? The ruins do not answer this. They only hum quietly in the dark beneath the reach, in the way that things hum when they have been running so long they have forgotten they were ever started. The Falmer are part of the same story, though that connection is rarely understood by those who encounter them in the depths of Dwemer ruins. The Snow Elves, the ancient Falmer before they became what they are now, were a sophisticated civilization that inhabited Skyrim before the arrival of the Nords. When the ancient Nords came from Atmara and began pushing across the land, the Snow Elves eventually sought refuge with the only group that might plausibly protect them, the Dwemer. The terms of that refuge, as recorded in the text known as Knight Paladin Gelibor's account and reconstructed from other fragmentary sources, involved the Snow Elves agreeing to consume a specific fungus that the Dwemer provided, which the Dwemer presented as food, but which over generations caused the Snow Elves to lose their sight and regress in ways that stripped them of everything that had made them a civilization. They became servants, then slaves, then something so transformed from what they had been that even their connection to their own origins was severed. By the time of Skyrim's events, the Falmer are deep cave creatures, blind and aggressive, with no visible memory of the culture they once had. The Dwemer who subjected them to this transformation are gone. The Snow Elves who survived in isolated pockets, like Knight Paladin Gelibor himself, preserved by faith and circumstance, carry a grief for what their people became that spans the same enormous stretch of time. Both transformations, the Dwemer's disappearance and the Snow Elf devolution, happened in roughly the same historical period, driven by the same philosophical ruthlessness that defined the Deep Elves at their most uncompromising. There are towers in Skyrim that predate everything else in the province, structures so old that the civilizations who built them have themselves become mythology, and the towers have outlasted the mythology to stand as objects with no clear meaning, only presence. These are called the Dragon Cult Towers, though that name describes only one layer of their history, and the history beneath that layer is murkier and stranger. The College of Winterhold sits near the ruins of one such structure, and the scholars there have debated for generations what the towers were originally intended to do, what they might still be doing, in some sense, invisible to the naked eye, and whether the collapse of the college's courtyard, which happened in an event associated with something called the Great Collapse, has anything to do with whatever function the nearby tower once served. The Great Collapse itself is one of the quieter mysteries in Skyrim's modern landscape, an event within living memory by the game's timeline, in which a significant portion of the cliffs below the College of Winterhold simply fell into the sea. The local Nords blamed the mages. The mages had no satisfying explanation. The rubble is still there, visible from the college's narrow walkway, and the question of what caused it sits inside the story of Skyrim's present-day tension between the college and the city of Winterhold, which was once a great city and is now almost nothing, reduced by the collapse to a handful of buildings clustered at the edge of what remains. The towers themselves are connected, in the cosmological thinking preserved in Elder Scrolls lore, to something called the Wheel, which is a metaphysical model for understanding how Nirn was created and how it is sustained. Each tower is thought to serve as a kind of anchor, a point at which the reality of the mortal world is stabilized against the dissolution that presses in from the edges of existence. The White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil is the most famous, but the towers of Skyrim carry their own weight in this system, and the question of what happens when a tower's function is disrupted or lost is not purely academic. There is a current within the Elder Scrolls tradition of thought that suggests the towers are not decorative or ceremonial, but structurally necessary, and that their loss or corruption introduces a kind of instability into the world that is felt not as immediate catastrophe, but as a slow wrongness, a quality of unease that spreads outward from the damaged anchor point, like a crack spreading through stone before the stone has acknowledged it is broken. Whether Skyrim's towers are intact, compromised, or something more complicated is a question the game raises obliquely in several places and never quite answers directly. The Eye of Magnus is one piece of evidence that something in Skyrim's cosmological structure is not quite as settled as the daily life of its inhabitants suggests. That artifact, discovered during the College of Winterhold's questline, is an object of power so significant that the Psijic Order, an ancient organization of mages from an island that periodically removes itself from the visible world, intercedes directly to manage its aftermath. The Psijic Order is one of the older unsolved mysteries in Skyrim's landscape of unanswered questions. They predate the Mages Guild by centuries. They operate outside the authority of any political structure in Tamriel. They appear and disappear at moments of cosmological significance, offer counsel that is precise enough to be useful and vague enough to avoid revealing what they actually know, and then withdraw to Artaeum, an island that exists in Tamriel's geography but that cannot be found by anyone not invited to find it. The Order's relationship to time is part of what makes them significant. Their magic involves an understanding of time as a substance that can be worked with rather than simply experienced, and several of the moments in which Psijic monks appear in Skyrim suggest that they are not reacting to events as they occur, but positioning themselves before events that have not yet concluded. The mystery of the Psijic Order connects to one of the stranger geographic anomalies in Skyrim, which is the question of what happens to places and people who become lost in ways that are not simply a matter of being difficult to find. There is a Nord concept embedded in the burial traditions of Skyrim that speaks to a place called Sovngarde, the Hall of Valor, where warriors who die in battle are received by shore and feast in a mead hall without end. The geography of Sovngarde is one of the things that makes the Skyrim main questline feel cosmologically significant in ways that other questlines do not quite reach. The player actually travels there. It is not a place described in texts or promised in songs. It is a physical destination accessible through a specific portal, and what is found there raises questions that the questline does not pause to address. The shades of ancient heroes, who should long since have ascended to Shore's feast, are instead trapped in the mists produced by Alduin's feeding. They cannot reach the hall. They wander, fading, in a place that was meant to be permanent, but that has become instead a hunting ground. The question of what it means for a soul to be consumed by Alduin, what is lost when that happens, and whether it is reversible, is addressed only obliquely. The heroes rescued from the mist by the Dragonborn's intervention are freed to return to the feast they were owed. Whether Alduin's other victims, those consumed before the Dragonborn arrived, are simply gone, is a silence the game allows to stand. Alduin's nature is its own mystery, layered beneath the surface of his role as the game's primary antagonist. He is described as the World Eater, the firstborn of Akatosh, the dragon who in Nordic mythology is destined to consume the world at the end of time. The question that the game introduces, but never fully resolves, is whether Alduin's appearance in the Fourth Era represents that end of time arriving early, having been delayed by the ancient Nords who used an Elder Scroll to cast Alduin forward through time rather than destroy him, or whether the apocalypse he represents is something that can be permanently averted rather than simply postponed. The Thu'um that the ancient heroes used to defeat him originally, the Dragonren shout that forces Alduin to feel what it is to be mortal, was not a weapon designed to kill him. It was designed to diminish him enough that he could be dealt with by other means. And the means by which the Dragonborn ultimately defeats him in Sovngarde raises its own quiet question. Alduin is not destroyed in any absolute sense. He is defeated as a presence, cast down from a position he had reclaimed, and the souls he had already consumed are not recovered. Whether the World Eater can be killed in any permanent way, whether the end he represents has been averted or merely delayed again, is a question that sits at the edge of the main quest line's resolution, like a draft fell through a door that has not been fully closed. The dragons themselves carry a thread of mystery in the way they function as a category of being rather than simply as monsters. They are not animals in any meaningful sense. They are expressions of Akatosh's will, beings for whom the difference between a concept and a physical form is less clear than it is for mortal creatures. The dragon language, the Thu'um, is not a language in the way that common speech is a language. Words of power in the dragon tongue carry the actual nature of the things they describe inside them. When a dragon shouts the word for fire, that word contains something of the essential nature of fire, not a symbol pointing toward it, but the thing itself in condensed form. This is why a dragonborn can absorb a dragon's soul and gain access to the shouts that dragon knew. They are not memorizing something abstract. They are receiving something real. The implications of this, for what language is and what it does, for what it means that mortal beings can wield the same fundamental force that dragons express by nature, are things the lore raises and then leaves open, the way a good question is left open, not because the answer is unknowable, but because the process of sitting with the question is itself meaningful. The Tower of Imzark, the Dwemer ruin that houses the discovery central to the Dawnguard questline in a slightly different context, and the oculory it contains, raises a question that the questline moves past without dwelling on it at length. The Dwemer built mechanisms for reading Elder Scrolls. This implies that the Dwemer understood what Elder Scrolls were, that they had a framework for interpreting objects that are, by their nature, self-referential and paradoxical in ways that break ordinary interpretation. An Elder Scroll contains information about events that may not have happened yet, or that happened in a form the scroll's reading affects rather than simply records. Reading an Elder Scroll blinds a mortal reader, because the information the scroll contains exceeds the capacity of a mortal mind to process without damage. The Dwemer built a machine that could do this. The sophistication required to even conceive of such a machine suggests that the Dwemer's understanding of the fundamental structure of Tamrielic reality was several orders of magnitude beyond what any other civilization has achieved before or since. What else they understood, what knowledge disappeared with them into whatever state they now occupy, is part of the enormity of what was lost when they vanished. The ruins they left behind are sophisticated enough to suggest a civilization of extraordinary depth, but they are also just the surface of it. The books, the records, the knowledge that lived inside the minds that disappeared is simply absent, and nothing built since has come close to filling that gap. The question of the Elder Scrolls themselves is one of the most carefully maintained mysteries in the setting's cosmology. The Moth Priests of the Imperial City are a monastic order dedicated to the reading and interpretation of Elder Scrolls, and the tradition they represent is ancient enough that its origins are not cleanly traceable, even to the scholars most invested in the question. What is known is that regular reading of Elder Scrolls causes progressive blindness, and that this blindness is not merely a side effect to be managed, but is understood within the tradition as something closer to a trade, an exchange in which the physical sight that is lost makes room for a different kind of perception that in fully blind moth priests becomes capable of reading the scrolls without the progressive damage that afflicts those who begin reading with their sight intact. The mechanism of this exchange, what exactly the scrolls take, and what they give in return, is not something the Order has made fully transparent in any text available within the game. They train their priests in an understanding of the scrolls that is never completely transmitted to the player, and the Order's relationship to the institution of empire adds a political layer to the mystery that the lore acknowledges without resolving. The Elder Scrolls, as objects, have a relationship to fate that is genuinely difficult to parse. They record events from multiple timelines, including timelines that did not occur, which means they are not straightforwardly prophetic in the sense of describing one fixed future. They are more like records of every possibility, weighted somehow by probability or significance, and what a reader receives from them is shaped by who is reading, when, and for what purpose. The blind moth priests have developed interpretive traditions for managing this, ways of narrowing the scroll's field of reference to the question being asked rather than receiving everything at once. Whether those traditions are reliable, whether the interpretations the Order has provided to emperors and councils across Tamriel's history have been accurate, is a question the history of the Third and Fourth eras complicates considerably. Several of the most catastrophic events in recent Tamrielic history occurred in circumstances where Elder Scroll readings had been consulted. Whether those readings were accurate and ignored, misinterpreted, or whether the scrolls had provided information that was true in a timeline that was subsequently not the one that manifested, is a knot that the lore acknowledges exists without providing the thread that would allow it to be untied. The Blades are an order whose history in Skyrim contains a mystery that is easy to overlook because it sits adjacent to something more immediately dramatic. The Order began as the Akaviri Dragon Guard, a group of warriors from the continent of Akavir who came to Tamriel specifically to hunt and kill dragons and dragonborn. When they encountered the dragonborn emperors Raymond Cyrodiil I, they submitted it to his service, recognizing in him something that exceeded the category of the threat they had come to eliminate. Over time, they evolved into the Emperor's personal guard, their dragon-hunting origins becoming a secondary identity beneath their role as protectors of the throne. But the original question of what drove the Akaviri to Tamriel in the first place, what they knew about dragons and dragonborn that prompted an organized expedition of warrior hunters across the sea, is something the lore mentions and then leaves largely unexplored. Akavir is a continent that the Elder Scrolls setting keeps at a distance, described in fragmentary travel accounts and cultural references that suggest a place of enormous strangeness and historical depth without ever making that depth fully accessible. The Syashi, snake-like beings who reportedly consumed all the humans of Akavir in some ancient historical event, the Tang Mo, the Kapo Tun, the Kamal. These are names from a geography that feels deliberately kept at the horizon of the setting's knowledge, close enough to exert influence, far enough that the nature of that influence cannot be precisely mapped. The Night Mother is one of the stranger presences in Skyrim's landscape of unanswered questions, because she exists at the intersection of several different kinds of mystery simultaneously. She is a figure venerated by the Dark Brotherhood, the Assassin's Guild that operates in the shadows of Tamrielic society, and she serves as the intermediary through whom contracts for killing are received. Petitioners pray to the Night Mother rather than directly to the Brotherhood, and the Night Mother passes their requests to a listener, a member of the Brotherhood who is able to hear her voice. The metaphysics of this arrangement are genuinely unclear even within the Brotherhood's own theology. The Night Mother was, according to the tradition, a mortal woman in life who offered her own children as sacrifices to Sithis, the concept of void and entropy that the Brotherhood worships as a divine force. As punishment for this, or perhaps as consequence of it, she exists in a state after death that is neither the conventional afterlife described in Nordic mythology, nor oblivion, but something in between, capable of communication but not of action, present in the world, but not in the world in any form that other people can perceive. The question of where exactly she is, what her existence feels like from inside it, and what relationship she has to Sithis as a cosmological concept rather than a cultural one, are things the Brotherhood's texts circle around without ever fully addressing. The Night Mother speaks. The content of what she says is transmitted through the listener. The listener interprets. And somewhere in that chain of transmission, questions accumulate that no one in the Brotherhood has ever been positioned to ask without already knowing the answers. Sithis itself, as a cosmological principle, connects to some of the oldest and least resolved questions in the Elder Scrolls setting. The idea that before creation there was a void, that the act of creation was in some sense a violation of that void's nature, and that the void exerts a kind of constant pressure against existence, pushing toward dissolution, pulling toward the absence that preceded everything, is a philosophical thread that runs through multiple traditions in Tamriel without ever becoming the explicit doctrine of any single institution powerful enough to impose a settled interpretation. The Dark Brotherhood represents one relationship to this principle, using it as the theological justification for a practice of ritual killing. But the broader question of what Sithis is, whether it is a divine being in any meaningful sense, or a principle so fundamental it precedes the category of the divine, and what the relationship between Sithis and Lorcan's trickery might be in terms of the deeper structure of why the mortal world exists at all, is a question that floats through the setting's deeper texts without ever quite landing. Blackreach is one of the most memorable locations in Skyrim, not because of what happens there, but because of what it is. An underground city of enormous scale, built by the Dwemer, filled with a bioluminescent blue light from plants and minerals that have never seen the sun, with its own weather patterns and its own strange quiet, and at its center, a Dwemer construct of unusual size and apparent significance whose full purpose is only partially explained by the quest line that brings you there. The presence of Falmer in Blackreach raises questions about the timeline of the Snow Elf devolution. How long ago did this particular underground ecosystem establish itself? What did the Dwemer intend for a space this large? The scale of Blackreach is difficult to fully account for, even within the Dwemer's already impressive tendency toward construction that dwarfs ordinary human scale. It feels like a city built for a population that was expected to expand indefinitely, a long-term project rather than a completed one, and the abandonment of that project at the moment of the Dwemer's disappearance gives the space a quality of incompletion that is different from ordinary ruin. Most ruins feel like things that once were finished and then came apart. Blackreach feels like something that was still in process when it was abandoned, frozen mid-gesture, the vision behind it still legible in the unfinished spaces. There is a mystery attached to Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince of knowledge and fate, that sits somewhat outside the usual frame of Daedric interaction because of what Hermaeus Mora actually is and what his realm contains. Where most Daedric princes have realms that express their domains in relatively straightforward ways, Hermaeus Mora's realm, Apocrypha, is a library, an infinite library in a very specific sense. It contains all knowledge, including knowledge that has not yet been discovered, knowledge from timelines that did not occur, knowledge that exists only because the question of it has been asked somewhere. The black books that serve as access points to Apocrypha are scattered through Solstheim and the broader world, and each one contains knowledge of a particular kind, knowledge that has a cost in some form, sometimes sanity, sometimes a transformation of the self that cannot be fully predicted in advance. Hermaeus Mora collects not just information, but the seekers of information, which is what makes him unusual among the Daedric princes. Other princes want things from mortals in relatively legible ways. Hermaeus Mora wants the process of wanting to know, the inquiry itself, and he is endlessly patient about acquiring it, because he understands that the desire to understand is one of the most consistent things about mortal creatures. People will keep coming to Apocrypha as long as there are things they do not know, and in an infinite library there will always be things they do not know. The Skal of Solstheim carry a cosmological tradition that is one of the quietly stranger elements in the extended world of Skyrim. Their spiritual framework centers on something they call the Allmaker, a creative principle that is distinct from and older than the Iadric pantheon worshipped by most of Tamriel's human populations. The Allmaker is not a being in any standard sense, not a god who can be appealed to in prayer and who may or may not respond according to some discernible will. The Allmaker is more like a process, the ongoing activity of creation that continues to generate and regenerate the world. The stones that appear throughout Solstheim in the Dragonborn questline, the Allmaker stones, are understood by the Skal as places where this creative force is concentrated and accessible. When those stones are corrupted by Mirak's influence, the effect on the Skal is immediate and total. The connection to the Allmaker is severed, and the people stand in place, moving mechanically to work on projects they cannot explain and do not understand, because the spiritual framework that gave their daily life meaning has been interrupted. The relationship between the Skal's Allmaker and the broader cosmological framework of the Elder Scrolls, particularly the question of whether the Allmaker is the same thing as the Iadric force of creation understood through a different cultural lens or something genuinely outside that framework, is a question the lore raises through the juxtaposition and then declines to answer. Mirak himself is a mystery in the sense that his story raises questions about what it means to be a Dragonborn in ways that the main questline does not fully address. He was the first Dragonborn, a servant of the dragon cult who turned against the dragons, who learned to bend them to his will using his own Dragonborn nature, who was eventually defeated not by the ancient heroes of Skyrim, but by Hermaeus Mora, who offered him knowledge at the price of service, and then kept him in Apocrypha for thousands of years when he attempted to break that agreement. The question of what those thousands of years were like, existing in Apocrypha, outside the normal flow of time, retaining enough of himself to plan and scheme, but trapped in a library of infinite knowledge, without the ability to act on anything learned, is something the game gestures toward without fully exploring. Mirak's bitterness is legible, his desperation is legible, but the interior experience of his particular imprisonment, what a consciousness becomes when it has been held in a place of infinite knowing, without the possibility of doing for an amount of time that exceeds the entire recorded history of the civilization he came from, is left as a blank that the imagination is invited to fill. The ancient dragon cult is one of the less examined mysteries of Skyrim's deep history, partly because the facts that are recoverable about it are easily overshadowed by the more immediate and dramatic story of the Dragon War. The cult was not simply a religious institution in the way that, say, the temples of Kinnereth or Talos are religious institutions. It was a governing system, a means by which the dragons thus maintained political control over the human populations of early Skyrim during the period when dragons and their priest intermediaries constituted the ruling class of the entire province. The dragon priests were powerful enough to survive death in a form, preserved in their burial tombs by the masks they wore and by rituals whose precise nature is not fully documented anywhere recoverable. They sleep in those tombs, and when disturbed, they wake and defend, not as ghosts or simple undead, but as something that has preserved enough of what they were in life to constitute a genuine presence rather than merely an echo of one. The question of what the dragon priests experienced during the intervening millennia, whether they were conscious in their tombs, whether time passed for them in any way they could perceive, is one that the game does not address, and that the dragon priests themselves, once roused, are in no mood to discuss. The Dragonborn has powers that the game explains in terms of their mechanics, while leaving the deeper cosmological question somewhat open. The absorption of dragon souls, the accumulation of knowledge and power that should by all logic take lifetimes to acquire, and that a Dragonborn can receive in moments of violent contact, is framed as an innate quality, a birthright of a particular divine lineage, an expression of Akatosh's blessing on certain mortal vessels. But the question of what it costs, what it changes, what the accumulation of many dragon souls does to a person over time, is something the game explores only partially. The other Dragonborns of history, the emperors who bore the amulet of kings, the septum line through which Akatosh's blessing passed as a matter of dynastic continuity, all of them were shaped by what they were in ways that went beyond simple power. Tiber Septim ascended to godhood after his death, becoming Talos, the ninth divine, whose worship is one of the central political conflicts of the Fourth Era. Whether that ascension was always the likely destination of a sufficiently powerful Dragonborn, whether the Dragonborn the player controls is aimed in a similar direction, regardless of which choices they make, is a question the lore surrounding the setting raises without resolving. Talos' status as a divine being is itself one of the most politically charged mysteries in the game's present-day setting. The Thalmor, the ruling body of the Aldmeri Dominion, argue with genuine philosophical consistency that Talos cannot have been a god because he was a mortal man, that the divine number is 8, and that the admission of a human emperor to the divine pantheon constitutes a falsification of cosmological truth rather than an addition to it. The Empire, or what remains of it after the White Gold Concordat, agreed to ban Talos worship as a concession in the peace that ended the Great War. The Stormcloak Rebellion in Skyrim has Talos worship as one of its central grievances, though the rebellion's relationship to Talos is entangled with questions of Nordic identity and imperial overreach that make it difficult to read as purely theological. The deeper question, whether Talos is actually divine in any cosmologically meaningful sense, is one the game declines to settle definitively. The mechanisms by which mortals can achieve apotheosis in the Elder Scrolls setting are multiple and strange, and the particular path Talos is said to have walked involves the same kind of manipulation of fundamental reality that the Dwemer attempted with the Heart of Lorkhan, though arrived at from a very different philosophical direction. Whether a god believed in by millions is a god in a setting where belief and reality have a documented relationship of mutual influence is not a simple question, and the game is wise enough not to pretend it is. The war between the Empire and the Stormcloaks carries its own unresolved question at a more human scale, which is the question of what Ulfric Stormcloak actually is and what his rebellion actually means. The Thalmor's intelligence files discovered during the main questline reveal that Ulfric was at one point a source of information for Thalmor intelligence operations, and that his capture, torture, and ultimate release during the Great War may have left him with information in his possession that benefited the Dominion's aims, regardless of his own intentions. Whether Ulfric knew he was being used, whether his rebellion serves Thalmor interests by keeping the Empire divided and weakened, and Skyrim destabilized, and whether the man himself is a genuine believer in Nordic freedom or a more compromised figure whose genuine conviction sits alongside something he has never fully examined, is a question the game places in front of the player and does not resolve. The Thalmor document is written from a perspective that has its own agenda. Whether its framing of Ulfric is accurate, self-serving, or some mixture of both is left for the player to weigh. The Civil War questline can be completed on either side, and neither resolution closes the political question that underlies the military one. The College of Winterhold is built on a site of magical significance that the college itself does not fully understand. The concentrations of magical energy in the area, the proximity to what was once the glacier of Sarthal, the ancient Nordic city that the Nords built over a discovery they made and then buried again, all of these are part of a layered site with a history that extends much further back than the college's relatively recent founding. The discovery at Sarthal that the college uncovers during its questline is one of the larger cosmological moments in Skyrim outside the main questline, because what is found there is an object of such fundamental power that the Psijic Order mobilizes to manage its aftermath, as mentioned earlier. But the question of how the ancient Nords knew to build a city over that particular site, whether they understood what was beneath them, whether the founding of Sarthal in that location was accident or intention, is something the questline raises, through implication, and then moves past. The Nords who built Sarthal were early Atmaran settlers. The earliest Nordic settlements were also often placed with reference to something that the settlers understood in terms their descendants no longer had access to. The placement of barrows, the location of early temples, the choice of specific sites for the first great halls of the ancient Nordic kings, all of these suggest a geographic sensitivity that was either inherited from Atmaran tradition or developed in response to something in the land of Skyrim itself that the early settlers could perceive and that later generations lost the ability to read. The standing stones of Skyrim are one of the more persistent quiet mysteries in the province's landscape. They appear throughout the wilderness, single stones carved with constellations and imbued with a magical effect that the player can access by activating them. The lore behind them is sparse. They are ancient. They are connected to the 13 constellations recognized in the common astronomical tradition of Tamriel, each of which represents a category of being or a set of qualities. The warrior, the mage, the thief are the 3 primary constellations, each grouping 3 lesser constellations within their influence. The serpent is the 13th, the one that does not fit within any of the 3 groups, the one whose nature is described as dangerous and unpredictable. The stones themselves predate recorded Tamrielic history in their current form, and who originally built them, in what tradition they were constructed, and whether they still function in the way they were originally intended to function rather than in some degraded approximation of their original purpose, is not addressed by anything in the game's texts. They are simply there, doing what they do, encountered by travelers who receive their effects without ever being invited to wonder where the stones came from, or why someone decided that certain places in the wilderness of Skyrim should become permanent points of magical access for any traveler who happened by. The burial barrows of the ancient Nords are one of the most atmospherically significant mysteries in Skyrim's physical landscape. They were not simply tombs. The presence of Draugr, The restless dead who inhabit those spaces is understood by most of the game's present day characters as a supernatural nuisance, an inconvenience of the old magic that the ancient Nords practiced, and that has no living practitioners capable of managing its aftermath. But the question of why the ancient Nords built their burial system specifically to keep the dead in a state of restless guard rather than allowing them to pass fully into whatever afterlife they were owed is something that the game's archaeology of those spaces suggests without explaining. Word walls, the structures within barrows that carry fragments of the dragon language in physical form, imply that the ancient Nords bury their warriors with something to guard, knowledge, power, or a specific duty that required a presence that could be sustained indefinitely. The Draugr who guard word walls are not guarding empty space. They are guarding something that the ancient Nord culture decided needed to be protected permanently, which raises the question of what threat they were anticipating, and whether that threat was ever resolved, or whether the barrows are still fulfilling their original function in a world that has forgotten what they were built to defend. There is a text found in various places throughout Skyrim called the Lusty Argonian Maid that has a reputation for comedy and is often noted for being incongruous with the generally serious tone of Skyrim's literary culture. But within the framework of Tamrielic literary history, it is actually a window into something more interesting, which is the survival of a particular genre of entertainment fiction across multiple eras and cultures. The text, or rather the first 2 volumes of what is apparently a longer work, circulates widely enough to appear in kitchens, bookshelves, and end tables across the province, suggesting that it is not a fringe curiosity, but something with genuine popular appeal. This is a small thing, but small things accumulate in the Elder Scrolls setting into a picture of a world with an interior cultural life more elaborate than the game's primary narratives require it to have. The question of what other literature exists, what other entertainment traditions and artistic movements and popular cultural phenomena fill the space between the historical events the game focuses on, is part of the larger mystery of what Tamriel is when it is not the setting of an adventure. The world feels inhabited in ways that exceed its usefulness as a game environment, and that excess is where a lot of the most interesting questions live. The companions of Whiterun hold a mystery that is relatively contained compared to the cosmological mysteries, but that raises questions about identity and continuity that matter. The Circle, the inner leadership of the companions, are werewolves, a condition they acquired through a pact that connects them to Hircine, the Daedric prince of the Hunt. The pact was not made by the current members of the Circle. It was made generations ago, and the current members are simply inheritors of it, people who are brought into the Circle and given the gift or curse of lycanthropy as part of their acceptance, without being fully informed of the conditions in advance. This is an ethical situation that the questline acknowledges without quite resolving, because the game frames the removal of the werewolf curse as an option available to the player character and to Kodlak Whitemane, the harbinger who sees the lycanthropy as a corruption of the companion's tradition rather than a feature of it. What Kodlak wants, specifically, is to be free of Hircine's claim on his soul so that he can go to Sovngarde when he dies, rather than to Hircine's hunting grounds. The question of whether souls that go to Hircine's realm experience something analogous to Sovngarde, or whether the hunting grounds are significantly worse from the perspective of someone who ends up in them, is left open in a way that makes Kodlak's urgency comprehensible but not fully explained. Hircine's realm, the hunting grounds, is one of the Daedric realms that the game describes in terms of what it contains, which is eternal hunting, without clearly establishing what the experiential quality of that eternal hunting is for the souls who end up there. For a warrior who valued the hunt in life, it might represent exactly the afterlife they would have chosen. For a scholar or a craftsman or a farmer, The eternal hunt would be a different kind of experience entirely. The mechanics of Daedric afterlife claims in the Elder Scrolls cosmology are not fully established anywhere in the texts available to players. Daedric princes can claim mortal souls under certain conditions, most clearly when a mortal has made a direct pact with a Daedric prince involving their soul. What the experience of existing in a Daedric realm as a soul, rather than as a living visitor, looks like from the inside is something no text from within the game world can reliably describe, because the mortals who could report on it are not in a position to communicate back. The theoretical frameworks for understanding it exist. The direct testimony does not. Azura is a Daedric prince who occupies an unusual position in the traditions of several cultures because she is regarded by the Dunmer not as a Daedra in the conventionally threatening sense, but as one of the three good Daedra, alongside Boethia and Mephala, the trio known as the Reclamations, who are contrasted with the corrupted tribunal of Vivec, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil. This distinction matters to the mystery of the tribunal in ways that the main Skyrim game does not fully engage with, because the tribunal were mortals who achieved something close to godhood by connecting themselves to the heart of Lorcan, the same divine artifact that the Dwemer attempted to use in their own ascension project. The question of what Azura's actual nature is, in cosmological terms, whether she is something genuinely outside the standard divine framework, or something that has simply cultivated a different relationship with mortals than most Daedric princes maintain, is one that the game raises through the presence of the Shrine of Azura in Skyrim's south and through the quests associated with it, without settling it. Azura's star, the artifact she is associated with, is a soul gem of theoretically unlimited reusability, a container for the essence of mortals that can be used and refilled indefinitely, which has its own uncomfortable implications that the questline gestures toward but does not dwell on. The Falkreath Hold in the southern forests of Skyrim is one of the areas that carries a quality of historical weight that the game does not fully explain in any single text. The cemetery outside Falkreath is the largest civilian burial ground in the province, and the lore around it suggests this is not coincidence, that something about the land in that region draws death to it in a way that exceeds ordinary mortality rates. The priest who maintains the cemetery speaks of the land with a reverence that implies long familiarity with this quality, and the various dark quest lines that intersect with Falkreath, the Dark Brotherhood questline beginning with a child's contract, Sinding and the Ring of Hircine, the general tone of the area's wilderness, suggest a concentration of something the lore does not name directly. The ancient burial sites in the area predate even the standard Nord barrow tradition, pointing to inhabitants of that land before the Atmoran settlers arrived, about whom almost nothing is recorded. The forest itself, the rift's transition into the darker, denser Falkreath canopy, has a quality in the game's environmental design that resists the cheerfulness of the broader Skyrim wilderness, and the question of why that particular corner of the province feels the way it does is one of the questions the game plants and then leaves to germinate slowly. The Greybeards, in their way of the voice, represent a contemplative tradition that sits at the center of some of Skyrim's most significant cosmological questions, while maintaining a studied neutrality about most of them. Paarthurnax, the dragon who sits at the peak of the throat of the world and serves as the master of the Greybeard Order, is arguably one of the most cosmologically significant beings still present in the physical world of Skyrim during the game's events. He is a dragon who chose to change, who fought against his own nature, which is the nature of dominance and consumption built into what dragons are, through a sustained practice of meditation and the study of the voice over a period of thousands of years. The question of whether Paarthurnax's transformation is real or performed, whether a being can genuinely change what it is at a fundamental level or only manage what it does, is one the game raises through the Blade's insistence that he must be killed for his historical crimes. The player is offered the choice without a clear signal from the game about which answer is correct. Both positions are presented with enough sincerity that the question remains genuinely open. Parthenax himself speaks about the effort required to resist his own nature with a specificity that suggests genuine understanding of what that effort costs, but he also acknowledges freely that the temptation to dominance is something he manages rather than something he has overcome. The distinction between management and transformation is one of the more philosophically interesting questions the game raises through one of its most thoughtful characters. The voice that can be heard at the shrine of Mehrunes Dagon in the Reach, the whispers that players sometimes report hearing in locations associated with Daedric activity, and the general sense in which the divine presences of the setting appear to be genuinely aware of and responsive to mortal activity, rather than simply being forces that mortals interpret as aware, points toward one of the larger unsettled questions in the Elder Scrolls cosmology. What is the relationship between Daedric princes and the mortal world in terms of genuine attention? Do the princes pay attention to individual mortals, or only to actions significant enough to produce ripples in whatever passes for their perception of the world outside their realms? The quests associated with individual Daedric princes suggest that the princes are capable of sustained attention to specific individuals, of something that functions like interest or even investment in particular outcomes. But the question of whether this constitutes consciousness in any sense a mortal would recognize, whether there is something it is like to be Molag Bal or Meridia or Azura, in the way there is something it is like to be a person standing in a field on a cold morning in Skyrim, watching the mist move through the pine trees, is one of the questions that the setting's cosmology raises, and that no in-game text is positioned to answer, because the answer, if it exists, is not available to mortal perspective. Meridia is one of the more interesting Daedric princes in this context because of the nature of her domain. She is associated with light and life, with the energy that animates living things, and that she distinguishes sharply from the corruption of undeath. Her artifact, Dawnbreaker, is specifically attuned to the destruction of undead. Her quest involves clearing her temple of a necromancer whose work has drawn her attention and provoked something that functions very much like anger in the terms she uses to describe it. The question of where Meridia sits relative to the Aedric divine forces is more complex than her Daedric classification immediately suggests. She is a Daedra in the technical sense, a being who did not participate in the creation of Nirn and who therefore retains her divine nature intact. But her animosity toward undeath and her association with life and light place her in alignment with values that are generally considered Aedric rather than Daedric, and the relationship between her domain and the domains of the divine forces who gave up their power to create the mortal world is something the game acknowledges through the way characters react to her quest, with a slight cognitive dissonance that suggests she does not quite fit the standard Daedric category, without explaining what the correct category would be. The ruins of Sarthal, the first settlement the Atmaran colonizers built in Skyrim, hold a story that involves one of the other elder mysteries of the province. The Nords who lived there were attacked, according to tradition, by the ancient elves of Skyrim, the Falmer in their pre-devolution form, in an event called the Night of Tears. The traditional Nordic account frames this attack as simple territorial aggression, and it is used to justify the subsequent Nordic campaign against the Snow Elves that drove them underground and into the Dwemer's protection. But texts found in the ruins of Sarthal suggest a different dimension to the attack, because the elves of that time apparently knew what was buried beneath the city, or at least knew that something significant was there, and their attack may have been an attempt to control access to that discovery, rather than simply to kill Nords. The Eye of Magnus, which the college quest uncovers beneath Sarthal, was apparently already there when the Atmarans built the settlement above it, which raises the question of how much the elves knew, how long they had known, and whether the Night of Tears was in any sense a calculated strategic action to prevent a powerful object from falling into hands that might misuse it, rather than purely the unprovoked aggression that Nordic tradition has always framed it as. History told by survivors tends to tell the survival as the most important part of the story, and the reasons for what they survived frequently get simplified in the retelling. The Soul Cairn, accessible through the Dawnguard questline, is one of the places in the extended Skyrim world that raises the most questions about what happens to the dead in this setting and who is responsible for managing it. The Soul Cairn is a realm that exists outside the normal parameters of the afterlife described in Nordic tradition, outside Sovngarde and outside the Daedric realms, though it has apparent connections to the latter. It is populated by the souls of people who were trapped there through soul gem usage, people whose essence was captured and used to power enchantments, and then, once spent, were deposited in this gray and lightless place, rather than passing to whatever fate would otherwise have awaited them. The ideal masters who govern the Soul Cairn are beings whose nature and origin are genuinely unclear. Their relationship to the broader cosmological structures of Tamriel, not fully established in any text available within the game. They trade in souls. They accumulated the Soul Cairn through transactions that span a very long period of time. Whether they represent an aspect of the divine framework that was always there or something that developed independently of it, and what their ultimate aims are in accumulating the kind of collection they have built, is a mystery the Dawnguard questline introduces without resolving. The Vampire Lord transformation available in the Dawnguard questline connects to the question of Molag Baal's role in creating vampirism, which is one of the creation myths within the game that carries the most uncomfortable implications. Molag Baal is the Daedric prince of domination and corruption, and the tradition within the Elder Scrolls setting holds that he is responsible for the existence of vampires as a category through an act of violation against a mortal woman named Lame Beolfag in the Merethic era that was so extreme it produced the first vampire as a consequence of what had been done to her. This is a creation myth structured around an act of profound harm, and the vampires who carry the inherited nature that resulted from it are permanently marked by their connection to Molag Baal's domain in a way that the game does not allow to be separated from what vampirism is in any cosmological sense. The question of what it means to be a being created through violation, whether such a nature can be fully self-determined, is a question the game raises most explicitly through the character of Serana, who is a vampire of exceptional age and whose relationship to her own nature has the complexity of someone who has had a very long time to think about what she is and has not arrived at a simple answer. The question of what the Falmer were, what they could have become, and what exactly was lost when the Dwemer subjected them to the transformation that destroyed their civilization is one that Knight Paladin Gelibor carries in a way that gives the Dawnguard questline some of its emotional weight. Gelibor is the last snow elf who retained his original form, preserved in isolation in the Temple of Ariel for thousands of years, maintaining his faith and his duty while everything that his civilization was disappeared in the caves beneath his feet. He describes his people with a specific kind of grief that comes from someone who saw them as they were before they became what they are, who can hold both versions simultaneously and who cannot stop doing so. The Snow Elves had a complex and beautiful culture. The Falmer in the caves are the consequence of what that culture became when someone else decided their survival was acceptable on terms that reduced them to servitude and then to something less than that. The particular cruelty of the Dwemer's treatment of the Snow Elves is that it was deliberate, systematic, and predicated on the philosophical position that some beings are simply less significant than others and can therefore be managed rather than respected. This is a position that the Dwemer's own fate, their complete disappearance leaving no survivors to perpetuate it, allows the historical record to view with a certain grim symmetry that is probably not entirely accidental. There is a question about Dawnstar that is easy to walk past without registering it as the mystery it is. The town experiences a recurring nightmare, a shared phenomenon in which every resident wakes from the same dream repeatedly, and this has been going on long enough that the population is visibly exhausted and frightened by the time the player arrives. The cause, when the Daedric questline reveals it, is the presence of a priest of Vermina, the Daedric prince of nightmares and psychological horror, and a specific artifact associated with her. The artifact is removed, the nightmares cease, and the questline concludes. But the deeper question of why Vermina's influence was concentrated in Dawnstar specifically, why that coastal town and not somewhere else, and whether there is something about Dawnstar's location or history that made it susceptible to this kind of intrusion, is something the game does not address. The answer may be simple, pure geographic proximity to wherever the artifact was stored, but the pattern of Daedric influence in Skyrim suggests that sites of Daedric activity often have something in common with the history of the land, that there is a resonance between certain places and certain kinds of power that is not simply accidental. The question of the Sigic Order's home island of Artaeum is one that the game mentions without making fully accessible, and the question of what it means for an island to be removed from the perceptible world and then returned is one that sits at the edge of what the cosmology makes legible. Artaeum has disappeared from accessible geography twice in recorded history, once for several centuries during the Merethic era, and once for approximately 100 years, beginning around the end of the Third Era. Where it goes when it disappears is described in the Sigic tradition in terms that are deliberately imprecise, language about the island being placed outside the flow of time, about the Order's meditations requiring a remove from the world's noise. This sounds like metaphor and may not be. The Sigic understanding of time as workable material suggests that removing something from the flow of time is a literal operation, not a poetic one, and that Artaeum in its absent phases exists in the same way that an object exists when it is placed in a pocket rather than on a table. It is not gone. It is simply somewhere else for now. The question of what that somewhere else is, what the experience of time looks like from an island that has stepped outside of it, is one that no one who has not been to Artaeum during one of its absences can answer, and the Order is not in the habit of answering it for those who have not been invited to ask. The question of what Ysgramor was, exactly, is one that the conventional historical treatment of him as a great Nord hero tends to smooth over. He was Atmaron. He was not a Nord in the sense that the Nords of Skyrim's Fourth Era would recognize, because he came from a place that no longer exists in any accessible form and carried a cultural context that the Nords who descend from his followers have only partially preserved. He led the 500 companions back to Skyrim after the Night of Tears, when the Snow Elves killed the colonists who had built Sarthal, and the campaign he ran against the ancient elves of Skyrim was the campaign that ended their civilization and drove the survivors underground into the Dwemer's keeping. This is the act that made the Nordic civilization of Skyrim possible, and it is celebrated as such. But the question of what it felt like to be the last kind of person, the person who remembered Atmora as it was, who crossed back and forth between the dying world and the new one, and who built something that was intended to replace what was being lost, and whether the companions Ysgramor founded were in some sense an attempt to preserve the culture of Atmora by giving it a new geographic home, is something that the mythology around him does not address, because mythology rarely preserves the texture of grief that underlies a civilization's founding. There is a quality to Sovngarde as a location that the game communicates through its environmental design more clearly than through any text or dialogue. It is large in a way that feels generous rather than oppressive, filled with a light that comes from everywhere and nowhere, and the Mead Hall at its center, Shore's Hall, is exactly what the songs promised it would be: enormous and warm and full of the sound of old heroes celebrating victories that no longer need to have consequences. But the souls encountered in the mists outside the hall, fading, diminished, being slowly consumed by Alduin's feeding, create a question that the rescue of some of them only partially addresses. How many souls had Alduin already consumed before the Dragonborn arrived? What was lost in those consumptions, not in terms of the individual, though that matters, but in terms of what those souls contained, the experiences of ancient people whose knowledge of how to live in a particular way, under particular conditions, died with them, and then was consumed again in Sovngarde, so that even the version of it that might have persisted in the afterlife is gone. The history that lives in people rather than in books is the most fragile kind, and the history of Skyrim's deep past was already poorly preserved in the Fourth Era. Alduin's feeding was making it actively worse. The presence of Shor in Sovngarde, or rather his described absence, is one of the quieter mysteries in the game's cosmological picture. He is present in the sense that Shor's Hall exists and is clearly sustained by something, that the souls in it are clearly being received by someone, and that the presence of Alduin in the mists of Sovngarde is treated as a violation of something that should be protected. But Shor himself does not appear during the main questline, and the ancient heroes who helped the Dragonborn defeat Alduin describe Shor's absence in terms that suggest it is both deliberate and connected to something that happened in the deep past of the divine relationship between the Aedra and their world. Shor is understood in Nord tradition as the champion of mankind, the divine figure most aligned with human interests, and his absence from active involvement in the world is something that the mythology treats as a self-imposed withdrawal rather than as a simple absence. Whether this withdrawal is permanent, whether it was chosen or compelled, and whether the events of Skyrim represent the kind of situation that might eventually call him back, is a question the game plants in the background of the Sovngarde sequence and leaves there. The Thalmor operate with a confidence about the nature of the divine that the Elder Scrolls cosmology's actual structure does not straightforwardly support. Their position that the Aedric divine number is 8, that the admission of Talos as a 9th divine represents a falsification rather than an expansion, is a theological argument that has philosophical consistency within certain assumptions, but that depends on those assumptions being correct in ways the broader cosmological tradition does not guarantee. Their own position as Altmer, as the race that considers itself closest in nature to the divine ancestors of elvenkind, gives them a stake in the question that is not purely philosophical. If Talos is genuinely divine, then the path to apotheosis is open to any mortal with sufficient power and the right combination of circumstances, which is a cosmological claim that significantly revises the significance of being born into elven lineage. The Thalmor's prohibition of Talos worship is not simply theological enforcement. It is the management of a metaphysical claim that would, if accepted, reduce the significance of everything they consider their people's greatest distinction. Understanding the Civil War conflict in Skyrim as having this cosmological subtext does not make the answer to who is right clearer, but it does make the question of what everyone is actually fighting about more legible. The question of what the snow elf religion looked like, what the ancient Falmer believed, and how they understood their relationship to the world is almost entirely absent from the available lore. Knight Paladin Gelibor provides some glimpse, because his faith in Oriel, the snow elf name for Ariel, The god known to the Altmer as the Divine King and to the Nords as Akatosh is the faith he has maintained for thousands of years in isolation, and the temple complex he guards is the most complete surviving example of snow elf religious architecture. But the broader religious culture of the snow elves, what they believed about the dead, how they understood their relationship to the land of Skyrim, what stories they told about how the world came into being, and what place they occupied in it, is essentially unavailable. The civilization was destroyed before it had contact with cultures that preserved detailed records of it, and the survivors who went underground were subjected to a process that eliminated not just their society, but the cultural continuity that would have carried their traditions forward. The bones of snow elf culture are almost entirely gone, leaving only Gelibor, who carries what he remembers of it, and the landscape of Skyrim itself, which was shaped by their presence in ways that the Nords who came after rarely attributed to them. There is a conversation available in Markarth that is easy to miss, but that opens onto one of the more interesting structural mysteries in Skyrim's political landscape. The Forsworn, the Reach natives who have been fighting a losing insurgency against the Nord and imperial control of the Reach for generations, have a history that goes back to a period called the Markarth Incident, in which a brief, forsworn governance of Markarth following the Great War was ended violently by Ulfric Stormcloak's forces, which required the Imperial Legion to allow Talos worship in Skyrim as a concession to Ulfric's willingness to intervene. This sequence of events is buried in the background of the Civil War and the Forsworn questline in ways that implicate almost every major political actor in Skyrim's present-day situation in the conditions that created the current conflict. The Forsworn are fighting for a homeland that was taken from them, as the Reach natives, the Reachmen, have legitimate historical claim to the territory that Markarth sits in. The Nords who drove them out have their own historical claim to it, established through earlier conquest. The question of how far back historical claims must be traced before they lose their standing, and whose history counts as the authoritative one, is a question that the Forsworn questline raises without being able to answer, because it is a question that has no resolution in principle, only in the particular power relationships that happen to obtain at any given moment. The Dwemer ruins in Markarth, the city that the Reachmen held briefly and that the Nords took from them, are built into the Dwemer ruins that make Markarth itself possible. The city exists because the Dwemer built it, and the current inhabitants of the city live inside the walls of a civilization they did not build and cannot fully understand, using spaces designed for purposes they do not know, walking corridors carved for a people who disappeared millennia before the first Nord or Reachman arrived to establish a claim. The irony of political conflicts over territory that was most definitively occupied by a people who vanished entirely is one that the game allows the landscape to express without editorializing about it directly. The Dwemer built something so permanent that it is still being used and fought over by cultures they never knew, which is either a kind of immortality or a kind of joke, depending on what mood you are in when you think about it. The mystery of what the Thuum is doing to the people who use it over time is one that the game does not address in any sustained way. The Greybeards meditate in near silence at the throat of the world, precisely because they understand that the voice is not simply a tool, but something that shapes the user in the act of using it. Paarthurnax has spent thousands of years studying the nature of the Thuum and its relationship to the mortal mind and body, and he speaks about this with a depth of experience that suggests there are long-term effects of sustained shout use that the game's mechanics do not represent, but that the lore acknowledges exist. What those effects are, whether they are changes in the quality of perception, in the relationship between the shouter and the things they shout about, in the fundamental nature of the self that does the shouting, is a question that the Greybeard's monastic tradition is built around managing without ever fully articulating. The way a master of any discipline eventually becomes unable to separate themselves from their mastery, the graybeards and the voice have become something like the same thing, which is either a spiritual achievement or a loss of something, depending on how you feel about the value of ordinary experience. The Night of Tears has a detail that is easy to miss, which is that the early Atmoran settlers of Sarthl apparently discovered something buried beneath the site before the attack that destroyed the settlement occurred. This means the sequence of events is not simply that the elves attacked to kill Nords. There was something already there when the Nords arrived, something that may have prompted the attack, and the question of what the early Atmarans understood about what they had found, whether they recognized it as significant, whether they tried to use it or protect it, or whether they were simply living above it without understanding its nature, is something that no recovered text from that period addresses. The Atmarans were not a literate culture in the sense of leaving detailed written records. They were an oral culture in transition to a settled one, and the knowledge carried by the individuals who were killed in the Night of Tears was largely unrecorded and therefore lost in the same event that killed the people who held it. What those early settlers knew about the land, about what they had found, about whatever it was beneath the ground in Sarthal, died with them and was then buried under the city the Nords built afterward, waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists who had lost all context for understanding what they were finding. The companion's connection to Hircine and the broader question of what Hircine is and wants in the world of Skyrim extends into the question of the hunting grounds as a viable afterlife option. The Nords have Sovngarde. The elves have various alternatives depending on their specific tradition. The Bretons have a relationship to both the Aedric pantheon and the Breton cultural tradition that reflects their mixed human and elven heritage. But the people who end up in Hircine's realm are not there because of an ethnic or cultural tradition. They are there because of a specific contractual situation that arose from a pact made by their predecessors and was inherited without full consent. What Hircine's interest in maintaining a collection of werewolf souls is beyond the simple love of the hunt that defines his domain is something the game does not explain. The Daedric princes each have domains that express something about what they are, and Hircine's pursuit of the great hunt through the collection of souls who carry the beast mark suggests that what he is hunting, in some ultimate sense, is something that exists in mortal creatures specifically, something that the experience of life and death and the hunt expresses in a form he values. Whether that means the souls in the hunting grounds are something close to honored participants in an eternal exercise that Hircine himself considers worthwhile, or whether they are simply prey, is a question the lore allows to remain open. The history of the Septim Emperors and their relationship to the Amulet of Kings is a thread that runs through the background of Skyrim's historical context in ways that matter, even though the events are centuries or more in the past. The Amulet of Kings was a covenant object, a physical representation of the agreement between Akatosh and Queen Alessia that established the Dragonfires in the Imperial City as the barrier preventing Mehrunes Dagon and his forces from invading Nirn directly. When Martin Septim destroyed the amulet to defeat Mehrunes Dagon during the Oblivion Crisis, he both saved Tamriel from the invasion and ended the Septim line as the mechanism through which that barrier was maintained. The question of what replaced that barrier, whether the absence of the Dragonfires leaves Nirn perpetually more vulnerable to Daedric invasion than it was under the Covenant, or whether Mehrunes Dagon's defeat created some new equilibrium, is one that the broader Elder Scrolls narrative leaves deliberately unclear. The fourth era in which Skyrim is set is an era without the Septim Covenant and without the Dragonfires, And the question of what that means for the structural security of Nirn against Oblivion is something that exists in the background of the game's political and cosmological content, like a door that everyone knows is less secure than it used to be, but that nobody has found a replacement lock for. Maser and Secunda, the two moons visible in Skyrim's sky, carry a mystery that is embedded in the Khajiit creation tradition and that touches on something strange in the cosmological structure of the setting. In the Khajiit tradition, the moons are understood as the body and shadow of Lorcan, the dead god whose heart fell to earth beneath Red Mountain. This is not simply a poetic image. The Elder Scrolls cosmology maintains a consistent enough relationship between symbolic and literal truth that the Khajiit identification of the moons as Lorcan's remains has to be taken seriously as a cosmological claim rather than dismissed as folklore. If the moons are what the Khajiit say they are, then the disappearance of the moons that occurred during the Void Nights, the period immediately preceding the Fourth Era, when the moons simply were not in the sky, is not simply an astronomical anomaly. It is an event with implications for the state of Lorcan's cosmic remains, and the return of the moons following the actions of the Thalmor, who take credit for restoring them, raises the question of what the Thalmor did, how they did it, and what it means that an organization claiming divine knowledge of the number of the gods was capable of affecting the condition of what may be a dead god's physical remains. The Thalmor's claim to have restored the moons is something the game's Khajiit companions regard with considerable skepticism, because the idea that the Thalmor caused the Void Nights in order to have the opportunity to end them and gain credit for doing so is exactly the kind of long-game political manipulation the Thalmor have demonstrated elsewhere they are capable of. The question of the dragon resurrection mechanism, the way Alduin raised the ancient dragon dead by using a specific shout over their burial mounds, is one that connects to the broader mystery of what dragons are in a cosmological sense. The word Alduin uses to raise them is not simply a magical command. It is a shout in the true sense, which means it carries the nature of the thing it describes inside it. The word for resurrection that Alduin uses must therefore contain something of the nature of resurrection as a concept, in the fact that this word exists in the dragon language, that a shout for bringing back the dead is a thing that can be known and used, raises questions about the relationship between the dragon language and the structure of reality that the game does not address directly. If words of power contain the essence of what they describe, and if the essence of resurrection can be contained in a word, then what does that say about the nature of death in this setting, and about what resurrection means for a being that is more concept than creature? The ancient dragons that Alduin raises from their burial mounds are not simply animated corpses. They are restored to something close to what they were, personality and memory, and the specific quality of being that made each of them distinct. The mechanism of that restoration is not explained, and the question of where they were before they were raised, whether they were anywhere in any experiential sense, is one of the quieter mysteries buried in the game's central conflict. There is a mountain in the Reach, not one of the peaks specifically named in any major quest line, that has a quality the game communicates through its environmental design rather than through any text or dialogue. The stone in that area has a particular color and a particular texture, and the forsworn camps set into its faces have a quality of deep habitation, of having been there long enough to become part of the landscape, rather than simply placed on it. The Reachmen who make those camps carry a tradition of hagravens and totems, and a magical practice that the College of Winterhold would classify as primitive in its methods, while acknowledging it as genuine in its effects. The question of where hagraven magic comes from, what tradition it is an expression of, and whether the hagravens themselves have a history that predates their current role as corrupted women who traded their humanity for power is something the game mentions in passing in various texts without ever making it the focus of any sustained investigation. The Reach itself has a quality of being older than most of Skyrim's history accounts for, a sense that the land carries memory from before the civilizations, whose ruins are the oldest ones the scholars can name, and the Reachman's magical practice may be connected to that older layer in ways that no living scholar has the context to trace. The question of what magic is in the Elder Scrolls setting, at a fundamental level, connects to most of the other mysteries, because magic in this setting is not simply a force that practitioners learn to use. It is apparently an expression of the same tonal architecture that the Dwemer studied, the same fundamental vibrations that underlie physical reality, and the fact that mortals can learn to access and shape it is itself a cosmological claim about the nature of mortal consciousness and its relationship to the structure of the world. The Mages Guild, the College of Winterhold, the various independent practitioners scattered through the province all work within a practical framework that takes the existence of magic as given and focuses on the techniques for using it rather than on the deeper question of what it is. Farengar's Secret Fire in Whiterun and Calselmo in Markarth are scholars of different aspects of the magical tradition, and both of them have dedicated their lives to understanding more than they currently do, but the understanding they pursue is the kind that can be acquired through study and experimentation. The question of what magic is at the level below technique, what it is that a mage is actually touching when they cast a spell, is one that the setting's cosmological texts point toward without ever fully arriving at. The companions and the circle carry another mystery inside their organization that is easy to overlook. The original companions of Ysgramor numbered 500, but only a fraction of them founded the Companions as an institution in Whiterun. The others dispersed, establishing the various warrior traditions of early Nordic culture, settling in different holds, founding different organizations. What became of those other 500 companions and their descendants? What traditions they carried that may have diverged from the Whiterun organization over the centuries, and whether any of those traditions survive in identifiable form in the Fourth Era is a question that the game plants through historical reference and then does not explore. The diversity of warrior traditions in Skyrim, the various fighters' guilds and military orders and mercenary companies that are mentioned in passing throughout the game may be expressions of this original dispersal, but the direct connection is never established, and the question of what was carried and what was lost in those dispersals across centuries of history is not one that any present-day character in the game has the perspective to answer. The weather in Skyrim, the specific quality of the cold, and the specific character of the snow is something that the game's environmental design communicates as more than simply a climate condition. The cold in Skyrim feels, in the way that a well-realized fictional world's physical facts can feel, like it is connected to the history of the place rather than simply to its geography. The province sits in the north of Tamriel, which accounts for the temperature, but the quality of the cold, the way the wind moves through mountain passes that have seen things happen in them that no living person remembers, has a character that the environmental design invites you to feel as meaningful rather than incidental. The Nords who live in Skyrim describe the cold in terms that suggest a cultural familiarity with it that borders on relationship. The cold is not something that happens to them. It is part of what they are, a physical expression of an identity that was forged in a place, at Mora, where the cold was even more extreme and where something happened that ended that civilization's viability as a place to live. The cold that the Nords carry with them through their culture, in their burial traditions, and their songs about endurance, and their specific conception of what it means to die well, is in some sense the cold of a place they left behind so long ago that the memory of leaving has become the memory of arrival. There are things in Skyrim that were there before the Nords arrived, and that will be there after whatever civilization currently inhabits the province has become the subject of future archaeology. The throat of the world, the highest point in all of Tamriel, carries a presence that is almost independent of the specific events that occur on its slopes during the game. The mountain exists as the mountain has always existed, indifferent to the particular drama of Alduin's return and the Dragonborn's response to it, and the word wall at the very peak where Paarthurnax meditates has been there long enough that the stone it is carved into has been shaped by the weather into something that blurs the line between carved inscription and natural feature. The questions the mountain holds are older than the questions the quest lines address, and they will remain after those quest lines have been completed, because the mountain is old enough to have accumulated questions that outlast any particular era's capacity to answer them. The fire inside a Nordic longhouse, the specific quality of warmth and light that it produces in a space designed specifically for it, with the smoke rising through a hole in the roof, and the cold pressing in from outside, and the warmth not quite reaching every corner, is one of the images that the Elder Scrolls setting uses consistently to create a particular feeling about what it means to be alive and awake in a world full of things that are older and larger than any individual life. The mysteries of Skyrim are not problems to be solved in the way that a door lock is a problem to be solved. They are the grain of the wood that the world is made from, the quality of the stone that gives the mountains their specific character, the particular temperature of a darkness that has been dark for longer than anyone currently alive has been alive. Some of them will eventually yield to inquiry. Others will maintain their silence indefinitely, not because the answers do not exist, but because the answers are of a kind that requires a different kind of mind than mortal beings currently have access to. The game ends, in each of its various endings, with the major questline's central problem addressed, and the world still full of every other problem it contained before you arrived. The dragons are still in the sky, the ones that were not part of Alduin's raised army, living their long lives in the heights of the mountains, and occasionally landing where they choose, and doing as they please. The Thalmor are still operating, still pursuing the aims of the Aldmeri Dominion with the patient confidence of an organization that thinks in decades and centuries rather than in the span of individual lives. The Falmer are still in the deep places, maintaining whatever has become of their existence without any awareness of the culture they came from or the tragedy of their transformation. The Barrows are still full of Draugr, who are still guarding things that were placed in their care before the memory of why anyone would want those things extends. The standing stones still stand. The rivers still run cold through narrow channels in the high valleys. The aurora still moves across the night sky in colors that the Nords have names for, and that the scholars of the Mages College have theories about, and that both the names and the theories only partially capture. And somewhere in Blackreach, the massive underground ecosystem of the Dwemer hums to itself in the dark. The automata still moving through corridors they were designed to maintain, the bioluminescent light still pulsing in patterns that suggest rhythm, if not exactly meaning, the whole vast system still running on principles that the people who built it took with them when they disappeared, leaving the running of it to the mechanisms themselves, which do not know they have been running alone for millennia and would not alter what they do if they did. The question of where the Dwemer went continues to sit in that hum, in the specific quality of the light, in the sound of brass feet on stone floors worn smooth by the passage of feet that are no longer there. The College of Winterhold's library contains fragments of texts that have not survived in complete form anywhere else in Tamriel, and the question of what is in the sections of those texts that have not survived is one that the archivist Urag Groshub carries with the particular frustration of someone who has dedicated their life to the preservation of knowledge and who understands the magnitude of what cannot be recovered because it never survived long enough to reach a place of preservation. Some of the fragments suggest traditions of scholarship that diverge significantly from the mainstream Tamrielic academic tradition, approaches to understanding magic and history and the structure of the world that were abandoned or suppressed or simply lost without enough remaining to reconstruct what they were trying to say. The library is remarkable as it stands, but the gaps in it are enormous, and the gaps in a library dedicated to the comprehensive record of human and elvish knowledge across several thousand years are a kind of negative space in which entire alternative understandings of Tamriel's fundamental nature might be hiding. Urag himself is an Orsimer, a member of the race that the broader culture of Tamriel has consistently underestimated and marginalized in ways that the game's present-day orc companions and quest lines push back against without fully resolving the historical question of what was lost when orc civilizations were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt over the course of Tamrielic history. The orcs are followers of Malakath, a Daedric prince who was himself once an Aedric being, transformed by the actions of other divine forces into something outside the standard divine categories. The question of what Malakath is, and what his relationship to his worshippers means in terms of the Orsimer experience of history, violence, and the particular dignity they maintain in the face of consistent cultural dismissal, is one that sits inside the Orc Stronghold questline in a way that the game acknowledges and then leaves for the player to sit with. Malakath's realm, Ashpit, is described as a place of endurance and struggle, which is a precise cosmological match for the lived experience of his most devoted followers in the mortal world. Whether that match is coincidence or design, whether Malakath shaped his realm to reflect his people's experience, or whether his people's experience shaped a being who then shaped the realm, is a question that the tradition of divine and mortal mutual influence in the Elder Scrolls setting leaves open on both sides. The strongholds of the orcs carry their own specific quality of historical depth, because each one is a community that exists in deliberate remove from the broader world, maintaining traditions that the broader world does not understand and generally does not try to. The Code of Malakath, the set of principles that governs life in orc strongholds, is not simply a set of rules imposed by a distant authority. It is a living tradition that the community sustains through daily practice and through an understanding of why those practices matter, an understanding rooted in an experience of the world that is different from the experience of the races who built the cities and wrote the histories that define what most of Tamriel calls civilization. The question of what the orcs know, what their specific history and specific relationship to loss and rebuilding has taught them about the nature of endurance and the conditions under which a culture can survive the repeated destruction of everything it built, is one that the broader Tamrielic culture has consistently been too dismissive of orcs to bother asking. That the knowledge exists, that it is being maintained in strongholds scattered through the wilderness of Skyrim and the rest of Tamriel, is something the game acknowledges through the texture of those communities, without ever making it the focus of any single sustained narrative. The question of what Riften is concealing is one that the Thieves' Guild questline addresses partially while raising additional questions that it does not close. The sewer system beneath Riften, the Ratway, is one of the more interesting pieces of architectural mystery in Skyrim because it suggests a city with considerably more infrastructure than its current population and political situation require, a network of underground passages and chambers that implies a history of the city at a different scale from what currently exists. The Thieves' Guild has made the Ratway their headquarters, but the Ratway was clearly not built for this purpose, and the question of when it was built, by whom, and what the city above it looked like when those passages were in regular use, is something that Riften's history does not fully address. The city has a complicated relationship to its own past, and the question of what Riften was before the economic decline that made it what it is in the Fourth Era, before the Thieves' Guild's influence became so thoroughly embedded in its civic life that the guild's interests and the city's interests became nearly indistinguishable, is one that the quest line raises through the texture of the environment without making it the subject of any direct investigation. The Nightingales and their pact with Nocturnal is one of the Thieves Guild questline's more cosmologically interesting elements, because Nocturnal is a Daedric prince whose domain is darkness and the unknown, the potential that exists in what has not yet been observed or named. Her relationship to luck, fortune, and the particular kind of shadowed favor that the Nightingales operate under is framed in the questline as a contractual arrangement, a trade of service in life for a particular kind of service in death, in which the souls of nightingales become guardians of the twilight sepulchre, the earthly nexus of Nocturnal's connection to the mortal world, for as long as the nexus requires guarding. The question of what this means for the people who entered the pact, what their experience of existing as soul guardians is like from the inside, and whether the nature of Nocturnal's domain means that the guardians exist in some state of productive unknowing that is different from simply being dead, is something the questline raises through the presence of Carlia's partner, who has been fulfilling this function for some time and who communicates something through his presence that the dialogue only partially captures. The Twilight Sepulchre is a beautiful location in design terms, and the beauty of it is connected to the specific quality of Nocturnal's domain, that darkness which is not empty, but full of the potential of what has not yet been determined. It is the most hopeful possible version of darkness, which is a strange thing to find in a Daedric context, and which points towards something about Nocturnal's nature that the typical classification of Daedric princes as forces of corruption does not quite capture. The question of what the Synod and the College of Whispers are doing, the two magical organizations that replaced the Mages Guild after the Oblivion Crisis, is one that is referenced in various texts throughout Skyrim without being directly explored in any questline. These organizations represent the political and institutional future of organized magic in Tamriel, and the fact that they are divided, pursuing separate agendas, and competing for imperial favor rather than collaborating on the advancement of magical knowledge is a consequence of the same political fragmentation that has characterized the Fourth Era more broadly. The College of Winterhold exists as something of an independent institution partly because it is far enough from the centers of political power that the Synod and the College of Whispers have not yet succeeded in absorbing or displacing it. The question of what happens to the college in the longer term, whether its independence is sustainable against the pressure of better funded and politically connected rivals, is one that the game's present-day questline does not address because it is a question about the future, and the future is one of the few things that even Skyrim's oldest mysteries have not yet accumulated. There is a letter found in various locations throughout Skyrim, different in specifics, but consistent in tone, addressed to a person who the letter writer clearly knows well and is clearly worried about, when the content of the letter describes a journey into a ruin that the writer has survived but that has changed them in some way they cannot fully articulate. These found letters, scattered throughout the game as world-building texture, raise a question that accumulates across the many of them. What is happening in the ruins of Skyrim to the people who enter them unprepared? The academic and institutional response to the ruins, the expeditions mounted by the college or by individual scholars, tends to record either successful discovery or simple death. But the letters suggest a third category: people who went into the ruins and came out different, changed in ways that do not fit either the success or failure framework, carrying something back with them from the encounter with the deep past that the ordinary social world they returned to did not have the language to process. The ruins of Skyrim are not simply dangerous in a physical sense. They are places where the distance between the present and a very different past becomes navigable, and what crosses that distance in both directions is not always what was intended to cross it. The Aretino family situation, which begins the Dark Brotherhood questline with a child performing the Black Sacrament in an empty house, is a small mystery within a larger one. Aventus Aretino ran away from the orphanage in Riften and returned to his family's home in Windhelm to perform a ritual calling on the Dark Brotherhood to kill the woman running the orphanage. The ritual itself, the Black Sacrament, involves materials and a specific process that Aventus knew from some source, which raises the question of how a child in the Fourth Era comes to know the specifics of a Dark Brotherhood ritual that is associated with a secretive criminal organization that most of Skyrim's population is only dimly aware of. The knowledge exists somewhere accessible enough that a child could find it, which says something about the Brotherhood's relationship to the popular imagination of Skyrim that the questline does not pause to examine. The other children in the orphanage, the ones Aventus left behind in his escape, are present in the game as minor characters with their own small stories, and the specificity of their situation, orphans in a city as deeply stratified as Riften, under the care of someone the game eventually confirms is abusive, is the kind of detailed social texture that the Elder Scrolls series is particularly good at including without comment, allowing the weight of it to rest on the observation alone. The Riften Orphanage questline, tangential to the Thieves' Guild and available as a purely optional act of spending gold to improve a child's life, is one of the game's more pointed small statements about what power is for and what distinguishes its use from its misuse. The ability to do goods that the player character accumulates over the course of the game is enormous by any ordinary standard, and the game occasionally creates these small opportunities to use that accumulated power on a scale that is completely disproportionate to the magnitude of the problem, spending what amounts to pocket change by late game standards to create a genuine positive change for a specific group of children in a specific building. The contrast between this and the epic scale of the main questline's stakes is not accidental. It is a design choice that reflects something about what the Elder Scrolls series has always understood about the scale of significance in a world where the largest problems and the smallest problems coexist and both require attention. The question of what Windhelm was before Ulfric Stormcloak's stewardship of it is one that the city's architecture and social geography both speak to without explaining directly. Windhelm is the oldest continuously inhabited city in Skyrim, built by Ysgramor himself, and the Palace of the Kings at its center is one of the oldest surviving structures in the province. But the city in the Fourth Era is a place of significant inequality and ethnic tension, with the Dunmer refugee population contained in a designated quarter called the Grey Quarter, and the Argonian dockworkers excluded from the city proper entirely. Whether this arrangement was the product of Ulfric's policies specifically, or a reflection of older patterns in the city's social geography, is something the game allows to be inferred without being stated, and the question of what Windhelm's relationship to its minority populations looked like under previous rulers, whether the inequality is a recent deterioration or a long-standing condition that different rulers managed with different degrees of indifference, is one that the Nord characters in the city are not positioned to answer honestly, because they are too embedded in the present arrangement to have perspective on it. The Dunmer of the Grey Quarter carry a history of their own that intersects with Skyrim's history in ways that the game acknowledges through the presence of Counselor Morvain on Solstheim, and through the broader story of what happened to Morrowind after the Red Mountain eruption and the Argonian invasion that followed it. The Dunmer who live in Windhelm are refugees, the end result of a catastrophic sequence of events that destroyed their homeland within living memory, and the texture of the Grey Quarter reflects what it looks like when a proud culture with a deep history of civilization finds itself suddenly dependent on the tolerance of people who do not share that history and have no particular reason to value it. The question of where the Dunmer go from here, what the Fourth Era looks like for a people whose homeland is largely uninhabitable and whose diaspora is scattered through a continent that ranges from indifferent to hostile in its reception, is one that Skyrim presents through the Grey Quarter and through Solstheim without offering any resolution, because it is a question that has no resolution available within the game's current timeline. The Tribunal, the three Dunmer who achieved godhood through the heart of Lorkhan, are absent from the Fourth Era in ways that the game references without fully exploring. Almalexia, one of the three, died at the hand of the Nerevarine during the Tribunal expansion of Morrowind. Sotha Sil, the strange mechanical divine who spent his existence building a miniature world in an extra-dimensional space, also died during the same expansion, having already been dead for some time by the point his body was discovered, killed by Almalexia. Vivek is the most mysterious of the three, because his fate is genuinely unclear. He disappeared around the time of the Oblivion Crisis, and various theories about what happened to him circulate within the lore. He may have ascended to a state that transcended conventional physical existence. He may have simply ceased to exist when the heart of Lorkhan was removed from Red Mountain and the source of his divine power was taken away. He may be somewhere, in some form, maintaining an existence that the Fourth Era's scholarship has not located. The god who wrote the 36 Lessons of Vivek, one of the most philosophically complex documents in the Elder Scrolls setting's library of in-world texts, the being who spent centuries as a living god and administrator of a civilization and poet and warrior and figure of extraordinary contradiction, is simply unaccounted for. And unaccounted for in a setting where divine beings have a documented tendency to not stay neatly in the categories assigned to them, unaccounted for carries an enormous range of possible meanings. The question of what the 36 Lessons of Vivek actually are is one that Skyrim's scholars who have access to them would debate interminably if they were fully represented in the game. The texts are written in a style that violates ordinary categories of genre and argumentation consistently and deliberately, shifting between autobiography and philosophy and poetry and what appears to be instruction in techniques that cannot be performed without access to capabilities that no living practitioner possesses. They describe events that are simultaneously historical and mythological, that could not have happened in the way described, and that the broader Elder Scrolls lore suggests somehow did happen, in some sense, that ordinary historical categories cannot process. The lessons teach, according to those who have studied them most closely, a way of understanding the relationship between narrative and reality that is different from the relationship assumed by ordinary historical writing, a way in which the story that is told about an event and the event itself are not separable in the manner that the academic tradition requires them to be separable. This is a difficult idea to hold, and the difficulty of holding it is apparently part of what the lessons are designed to produce in the reader. The Hist, the ancient trees of Black Marsh that the Argonians maintain a symbiotic relationship with, are one of the most genuinely alien presences in the Elder Scrolls setting because of what they appear to be and what the Argonians' relationship to them implies about the nature of consciousness and communication in this world. The Hist are old, older than most of the civilizations whose ruins define the archaeology of Tamriel. They communicate with the Argonians through the sap the Argonians drink, a process that is more than simple consumption and appears to involve a transfer of something that functions like memory or collective knowledge, the specific content of which varies by tree and by Argonian. The Argonian recall of the Oblivion Crisis, the sudden and unexpected reversal of a Daedric invasion that had been proceeding catastrophically, is attributed in the lore to the Hist having somehow anticipated the invasion and prepared the Argonians for it in advance, altering their biology in ways that made them more effective combatants before the fighting began. The question of how a group of trees anticipated a Daedric invasion and what their understanding of events occurring outside Black Marsh looks like is one that the Argonian questlines in Skyrim gesture toward without making fully accessible, because the Hist's perspective on the world is not one that can be translated directly into any language that non-Argonians speak. The question of what Blackwood conceals, what the deep swamp geography of Black Marsh holds in its oldest and least explored interior, is connected to the mystery of Argonian origin in a way that the game mentions and then declines to pursue. The Argonians are not simply a race of lizard people. Their relationship to the Hist suggests something about the nature of their creation that is different from the creation narratives of the other races of Tamriel, a connection to the land itself that is more literal and more biological than the spiritual connection that other cultures maintain with their patron divine forces. Whether the Hist created the Argonians in any meaningful sense, whether the Argonians are expressions of the Hist's need for mobile agents in the world, or whether the relationship is something more mutual and more strange than either creation or symbiosis suggests, is a question that the lore raises, and that the Argonian characters in Skyrim reflect in the specific quality of their self-understanding, which tends to be calm and deep and rooted in something that does not require external validation. There is a fragment of a text available in several places throughout Skyrim that describes a phenomena called dragon breaks, moments in Tamrielic history when the linear experience of time fractured in a way that allowed multiple contradictory outcomes of a specific event to all be simultaneously true. The most documented dragon break is called the Middle Dawn, a period of approximately 1,000 years during which time ceased to function in a coherent manner across Tamriel, during which events that could not logically coexist were all somehow real, and at the end of which the experience of everyone who had lived through it was that only a single day had passed. The mechanisms by which this happened and the conditions necessary to produce it are subjects of enormous scholarly interest within the game's tradition, and the question of whether the events of Skyrim itself, particularly the involvement of Elder Scrolls in the main questline's time manipulation, represent the beginning conditions for another dragon break, is one that the more cosmologically aware characters in the game raise obliquely without committing to an answer. The Elder Scrolls that are used during the main questline are not simply archaeological artifacts. They are objects capable of altering the structure of what happened, and the alteration of what happened has documented consequences for the coherence of the timeline that extend beyond the specific event being altered. The question of what is under Solitude is separate from and older than the city that currently sits above it. The Blue Palace has a history that the people who live in it have largely lost access to, and the specific location of Solitude on the great arch of rock above the estuary carries a geographic distinctiveness that implies whoever first built there chose that location for reasons beyond simple defensibility, though defensibility alone would be sufficient to explain the choice. The Bard's College in Solitude is one of the quietly important institutions in Skyrim's cultural landscape, because it represents the preservation of a tradition that is genuinely old, the Nordic tradition of oral history carried in song and story, which is the tradition that maintained the cultural memory of Atmora and the Crossing and the Night of Tears in the absence of written records that could have done so more reliably. The bards are the keepers of the deep cultural memory of the Nord people, and the question of what is in the oldest songs in their archive, the ones that reference things that no longer exist and names that no living scholar can identify, is one that the game suggests rather than explores. The archive of the Bard's College is a repository of things that survived because someone decided they were worth singing, and what the filter of that decision process preserved and what it allowed to fade is a question about what a culture decided to remember of itself, which is never the same question as what actually happened. The question of the ebony blade found in Whiterun's Dragon's Reach, in the secret room behind the Jarl's quarters during the associated questline, is connected to a mystery about Mephalah's nature and goals that goes deeper than the questline itself explores. The blade is Mephalah's artifact, associated with the Daedric Prince of secrets and manipulation and the specific kind of harm that comes from betrayal rather than open conflict. The blade grows stronger as it is used to kill people who trust the wielder, and the questline that unlocks the secret room involves manipulation and the uncovering of a secret that the secret's keeper did not intend to reveal. The question of what Mephalah is ultimately working toward, what the collection of secrets and the cultivation of betrayal serves in the longer run of her purposes, is one that the questline raises through the artifact's nature without answering. Daedric princes have long-range purposes that mortal understanding cannot easily track, and Mephalah's domain of secrets and webs of manipulation suggests an intelligence engaged in something that operates at a scale of time and complexity that individual mortal interactions represent only the smallest possible unit of. What the web looks like when you could see the whole of it, and what it is designed to catch, is a question that the questline deposits in the mind and leaves there. The Hagraven transformation, the process by which a woman gives up her humanity to become a Hagraven in exchange for power, is one of the darker mysteries in Skyrim's magical landscape because of what the transformation implies about the nature of the magic involved and the specific things that are traded away. Hagravens retain their intelligence and their magical capability, but they lose something in the transaction that is visible in the quality of their presence in the world. The specific nature of what is lost is not fully articulated in any text, but the association between Hagravens and Forsworn culture, and the role of Hagravens as the senior magical authority within Forsworn camps, suggests that the transformation is not simply a personal decision, but a social institution within the Reach's magical tradition, a path that women choose or are chosen for that serves a specific function in the community. The question of how this tradition developed, whether it predates the Forsworn as a political entity and belongs to the deeper Reachman magical heritage, and what the Reachmen understand about the transformation that makes it worth the cost, is something the game allows to hover in the background of the Forsworn questline without addressing. There is a persistent quality to Skyrim's ruins that is worth dwelling on for its own sake, separate from any specific mystery they contain. The ruins are old enough that they have become part of the landscape in a way that newer structures have not. They do not sit on the land so much as they emerge from it, the way geological features emerge, the stone of their walls continuous with the stone of the ground beneath them, the moss and lichen and the slow colonization of plant life blurring the line between what was built and what grew. Walking through one of the older ruins, the ones that predate even the dragon cult's use of them, is an experience of time that does not require anything to happen. The ruin itself is the event, the accumulation of centuries of weather and silence, and the quiet persistence of stone that was placed in its position by hands that wanted it to last. Whether it lasted for the reasons those hands intended, whether what survives of it serves any purpose related to its original function, is impossible to say from inside the ruin. The ruin does not know. It simply continues, because continuation is what stone does. The question of what the ancient Nord heroes interred in Sovngarde actually did in life, beyond the deeds the songs record, is one that the brief conversations available in Shore's Hall during the main questline raise, without having time to explore. The heroes there are real presences rather than representations, beings who carry the full weight of their actual histories rather than the simplified versions preserved in the bardic tradition. What Gormleth Golden Hilt experienced in the years between her greatest battle and her death. What Feldir the Old understood about the Elder Scroll he used, and what the use of it cost him personally, what Hakon One Eye believed about the choice they made when they cast Alduin forward through time rather than destroying him, and whether that belief changed as the consequences of that choice played out across the centuries he spent in Sovngarde watching the world he had tried to protect from outside its edges, are questions that the game plants by putting you in the room with these people and then not providing a mechanism for the conversations that would answer them. The voice of Paarthurnax, speaking through the language that contains the nature of things within its words, carries a quality that the game communicates through its audio design in addition to its dialogue. There is something about the way dragons speak in this setting that reflects what they are, beings who do not separate the expression of a thing from the thing itself in the way that mortal language does. When Paarthurnax speaks about time, about change, about the difficulty of resisting one's own nature, the words carry something of the weight of actual time and actual difficulty, not as symbol or representation, but as the thing itself in condensed verbal form. This is what makes the conversations with him feel different from conversations with mortal characters, even very wise and old mortal characters. The content of what he says is often similar to what a wise mortal might say, but the medium of its delivery is doing something that mortal speech cannot quite do, and the difference between the content and the medium is where the specific quality of those conversations lies. The ruins of Helgen, destroyed at the game's opening by Alduin's return, are one of the few locations in Skyrim that changes during the game's timeline in a way that reflects events rather than simply existing in a fixed state. The burning ruins at the beginning become, if the player returns later, simply ruins, still smoking in some versions of the timeline, cooling and settling into the new condition that catastrophe creates when it has finished happening. The town of Helgen before the attack is glimpsed only briefly, only enough to establish what it was and what is lost, and that brevity is part of what gives the game's opening its specific emotional tone. You arrive in a place that is about to cease to exist, surrounded by people who do not know this yet, and the knowledge of what is coming creates a quality of attention to the ordinary details of Helgen's life that the game allows without directing. The people arguing in the street, the child watching the execution from a distance, the specific quality of the morning light through the mountains, all of it is available to observation for a brief period before the dragon arrives, and the observation becomes survival. What Helgen was before that morning in the longer history of the Hold is something the game leaves almost entirely unexplored, allowing Helgen to exist primarily as a place of ending rather than of continuation. There is a version of Skyrim's history in which the dragons never returned, in which Alduin was either finally destroyed when he was cast forward through time or was held there indefinitely, in which the Dragonborn was never needed because the threat that the Dragonborn was designed to address never materialized. In that version of history, what becomes of the Thuum, the voice, the dragon language that the ancient Nords learned from the dragons themselves before the Dragon War ended the period of dragon dominance? Does it fade, preserved only in the Greybeard tradition and the word walls, becoming increasingly arcane, increasingly inaccessible, until eventually it is simply a scholarly curiosity rather than a living practice? Does the tradition of the Greybeards continue regardless, people drawn to the meditative discipline of the voice for reasons that do not require the specific emergency of Alduin's return to justify them? The question of what the world looks like in the versions of its history where the central emergencies did not occur is one that the setting's relationship to dragon breaks and alternate timelines makes available as a genuine question rather than simply a hypothetical. In a setting where multiple contradictory outcomes have coexisted as simultaneously real, the version of Skyrim where everything went differently is not merely imaginary. It may simply be inaccessible. The question of what happens to the Dragonborn after the game's main questline ends is one that the game deliberately leaves open and the openness of it is appropriate because the question of what a dragonborn is in the long run, what the accumulation of dragon souls and the mastery of the voice, and the specific cosmological significance of being the being that Akatosh designed to counter Alduin does to a person over the course of a long life, is one that no dragonborn before this one has been in a position to document. The septum line ended with Martin. The previous dragonborns of history either died in the service of their role or transcended in ways that did not leave accessible records. The player character stands at the beginning of a story that the game tells you the beginning of without showing you the end, and the end is in the empty space after the credits, in the continuation of a world that is still full of questions, and now also full of someone who has touched the fundamental structure of what dragons are and has returned from Sovngarde carrying the experience of having been there, which is not nothing and is not everything, and is somewhere in the space between those two conditions where most of the interesting things in any world tend to live. The question of Labyrinthian, the great ruined city in the mountains of the Hjalmarch Hold, is one that the College of Winterhold questline approaches from a specific angle without being able to address the full depth of what Labyrinthian is. The ruins are enormous, far larger than any single structure's function could account for, and the variety of things found within them, the ancient Nordic corridor, the dragon priest Moroke, the staff of Magnus, the bronze door that requires a specific spoken phrase to open, all suggest a site that accumulated significance over a very long period of time and that served different purposes under different civilizations in sequence. The ancient Nord settlement that became a dragon cult center, that became a place where something cosmologically significant was stored. This kind of layered repurposing is common in Skyrim's ancient sites, and the layering at Labyrinthian is among the deepest and the least clearly documented. The expedition, records left by previous college scholars who attempted to enter Labyrinthian and who did not survive the attempt, are one of the game's most quietly effective pieces of environmental storytelling. A record of curiosity and courage, and the specific quality of knowledge that comes too late to save the people who paid for it. The Siege of Labyrinthian, the great battle in which the previous Archmage Savos Aran and his fellow students entered the ruin on what they described as an expedition and from which only Savos returned, is a mystery that the questline resolves in its immediate particulars while leaving the larger question intact. What Moroke is, why a dragon priest of that level of power is guarding the staff of Magnus specifically, and whether the arrangement in which he guards it is one that was designed or simply one that developed because Moroke was already there and the staff was placed near him for reasons related to the proximity of power, is something the questline does not pause to explain. The dragon priests as a category guard things and guard places, and the question of whether they guard the specific things they are found near because someone placed those things in their care, or whether they simply guard the general vicinity of wherever they were originally buried and objects of power accumulated near them over time, because objects of power tend to accumulate near other objects of power, is one of the quieter organizational questions in Skyrim's archaeology. The question of Nightcaller Temple and the quest associated with Vermina that is available in Dawnstar brings up a mechanism of the dream stride that is one of the stranger magical phenomena in Skyrim's documented repertoire. The ability to enter other people's dreams, to experience their dream state from inside it, and to carry that experience back into the waking world while the dreamer continues having a dream that now has a visitor in it who was not there before, is a magical capability that Vermina's priests developed and that the questline uses without fully explaining the theoretical basis for it. The relationship between the dreaming mind and the waking mind, between the reality of dream experience and the reality of waking experience, in a setting where the line between those categories is considerably less firm than ordinary common sense would suggest, is one of the questions the Vermina questline opens and leaves open. Dreams in the Elder Scrolls setting are not simply the processing of daytime experience by a sleeping mind. They are a space in which other presences can operate, in which information from sources that do not exist in the waking world can be received, and in which the quality of a person's inner life, their fears and desires, and the specific texture of what they cannot face becomes a kind of geography that can be navigated by those with the means to navigate it. The question of Ronveig's Fast, the ruin in the volcanic tundra of Eastmarch, is a small mystery that points toward a larger one. The ghost of Ronveig herself, who appears in the ruin she presumably once inhabited or was buried in, performs a function that is different from the Draugr who populate most Nordic burial sites. She is not defending a word wall. She is not guarding a specific object. She appears to be luring people into a trap that is no longer maintained by any living person, a trap that was set up by a conjurer who has since been killed, and that continues to operate on the automated logic of the trap itself, collecting victims in a cage below the ruin without any ongoing intention behind it. The question of whether Ronveig is aware of this, whether the ghost that appears at the entrance of the ruin understands that she is being used as bait for a mechanism that the person who installed it is no longer around to benefit from, is one that the small questline associated with the location raises without answering. Ghosts in Skyrim tend to be purposeful entities, presences with a specific unfinished quality that grounds them to the location where they appear. Whether Ranveig's purpose is to lure because the trap has become her purpose through association, or whether she is trapped there for reasons that have nothing to do with the conjurer's cage below, is a question the environment poses without dialogue to resolve it. The abandoned buildings throughout Skyrim cities, the houses with boarded windows, and the vendors' stalls that stand empty, and the guild halls that are clearly no longer in regular use, are one of the ways the game communicates the condition of the province without stating it directly. Skyrim in the Fourth Era is a place under stress from the Civil War, from the economic disruptions that followed the White Gold Concordat, from the lingering effects of the Oblivion Crisis on the infrastructure and population of the whole of Tamriel. The empty houses are the visible remainder of people who left or died or simply found that what they were doing in that place was no longer viable, and the specific character of each empty building, what it was and what condition its abandonment left it in, is part of the larger environmental picture of a province that is carrying more history than its current population can fully manage. The Skyrim the player walks through is not a stable or thriving society in any straightforward sense. It is a society in the middle of several simultaneous crises, most of which predate the player's arrival, and none of which the main questline's resolution fully addresses. The abandoned buildings are still abandoned at the end of the game. The people who left them have not come back. There is a question about the waterfalls of Skyrim that is almost too small to be called a mystery, but that has the quality of a good small question, which is that several of the waterfalls in the province fall from heights and into bodies of water with a power and volume that the apparent water sources upstream do not obviously account for. The rivers of Skyrim flow with a consistency that suggests either a very significant snowmelt feeding them continuously or a water table with properties that the surface geography of the province does not fully explain. The question of what is under Skyrim, in terms of water, what aquifer or underground river system sustains the surface drainage, is one that the Dwemer ruins partially answer, because those ruins thus include sophisticated water management infrastructure, and the question of whether the Dwemer's underground constructions altered the hydrology of Skyrim in ways that still operate is one that nobody currently living in the province has the expertise or the access to investigate. The water that falls from Skyrim's waterfalls may, in some portion, be moving through infrastructure that the Dwemer built and that continues to function because the automata maintain it, routing water through channels that were designed by engineers who have been absent for 3,000 years, serving a landscape that no longer knows why the water flows the way it does, only that it does. The question of what Hermaeus Mora knows about the Dragonborn specifically, what interest the Prince of Forbidden Knowledge takes in a being who can absorb the accumulated knowledge of dragon souls as a function of their nature, is one that the Dragonborn questline raises through the structure of Hermaeus Mora's involvement in it. Mora's assistance to the Dragonborn against Miraak is not altruistic in any obvious sense. He trades one Dragonborn for another, acquiring a new agent in exchange for allowing the old one to be eliminated. What Mora sees in the Dragonborn, what specific form of knowledge or potential knowledge a being who can receive dragon soul downloads represents from the perspective of a prince whose domain is the accumulation of everything that can be known, is something the questline implies without articulating. The Dragonborn's nature makes them a collector of a very specific kind of knowledge, the experiential knowledge of dragon existence, and whether Hermaeus Mora considers this collection valuable in ways that go beyond what the Dragonborn themselves could use, whether the prince intends to eventually receive that collection in some form, is a question that the structure of their deal in the Dragonborn questline raises without closing. The question of what the giants communicate among themselves is one that the game raises through the existence of giant camps and giant society, without providing any mechanism for the player to access it. The giants are not hostile without provocation. They maintain mammoths, they tend fires, they have a social structure that is visible in the organization of their camps and in the consistent features of their encampments across the province. They react to music, or at least to the Bard's College questline, suggests something in that direction. Whether they have language in any sense that would be recognizable to a linguist, whether the specific gestures and vocalizations they use with each other carry meaning in the way that meaning is carried by the languages the game's other races use, is something that no present-day scholar appears to have investigated or survived investigating. The giants are a civilization, or something that resembles a civilization, in enough of its features to deserve the consideration and the question of what they understand and what they value and what they remember of their own past, if they have a sense of their own past at all, is one of the mysteries of Skyrim's present-day landscape that no questline touches, because it would require a form of cross-cultural communication that the game's mechanics do not support, and that nobody in the game has apparently managed outside of the basic mutual understanding that giant space should be respected. The question of the Reachman's Hagravens raises the question of the Reachman more broadly, and the question of the Reachman raises the question of what the Reach was, before either the Nords or the more recent waves of settlement changed it. The Reach is the westernmost hold of Skyrim, and its geography, the jagged stone, and the particular quality of its light, and the way the Dwemer ruins fit into the landscape, as if they grew there rather than being built there, gives it a character that is different from the rest of the province, in ways that go beyond simple geography. The people who call the Reach home carry this difference in their culture, in the specific form of their magical practice, in the way they relate to the land they live in, which is less like property ownership and more like kinship. The question of how far back that kinship goes, what the Reachmen are the continuation of, whether there were people in the Reach before the Falmer, before whatever civilizations the geological record of the Reach suggests preceded even the oldest elven settlement of Skyrim, is one that the game plants through the texture of the Reach without providing any way to dig into it. The Dwemer tonal architecture is connected to a larger question about the fundamental nature of Nirn as a physical object, one that several of the setting's deepest texts approach from different angles without any of them arriving at a settled description. The world of Nirn was created through a process that the various creation myths describe differently, but that most of them agree involved the sacrifice of something by divine beings who had never sacrificed anything before, and the world that resulted from that sacrifice carries the quality of that originating act within it, the way an object carries the mark of how it was made. The tonal architecture of the Dwemer was an attempt to interact with that originating quality directly, to touch the fundamental note at which Nirn vibrates, and to adjust it in controlled ways. Whether any other culture has ever successfully done something comparable, whether the magic practiced by the College of Winterhold or the Thu'um of the Greybeards represent cruder or more refined versions of the same underlying operation, is a question that the setting's cosmological texts leave deliberately ambiguous, because the answer to that question would require an understanding of what magic is at a fundamental level that the setting is not prepared to make fully available. The stars of Skyrim's sky are not simply stars in the way that the stars of a mundane world are stars. The in-world astronomy of Tamriel understands the constellations as expressions of divine forces, as windows through which the power of the Aetherius, the plane of pure magic that lies beyond the mortal world's sky, reaches the physical world below. The 13 constellations, the warrior and the mage, and the thief and their associated groupings, plus the serpent who belongs to none of them, are the same constellations that the standing stones of Skyrim embody. Whether the standing stones are simply symbols of the constellations, or whether they are actual conduits for the power that flows through the constellations themselves, is a question that the magical tradition has multiple answers to and no consensus on. What the stars actually are on the other side of the sky, in Aetherius itself, is a question that the few accounts of travel to or vision of Aetherius that exist in the game's lore describe in terms that suggest a place of such radically different nature from Nirn that the descriptive vocabulary available to mortal travelers begins to break down almost immediately. It is too bright. It is too full. It is made of something that mortal bodies were not designed to be in contact with for extended periods, and the people who have visited it and returned are unanimous on the point that the return was necessary, and that the visit could not be sustained indefinitely. The question of what the Dwemer were building toward at the ultimate scale of their project is one that even the most sophisticated analysis of their surviving texts cannot fully answer, because the answer depended on a step that never completed. They were building the Numidium to use the heart of Lorcan to achieve something that would elevate their people beyond the mortal condition. But the specific form of that elevation, what they intended to become, and what the world they intended to inhabit after the transformation would have looked like, is something that no surviving text describes in the concrete terms that would make it imaginable. The Dwemer wrote in a way that assumes shared context among readers, that assumes the audience understands the goal even when the text is explaining the method. And the shared context that would make the goal legible disappeared with the people who shared it. The ruins carry the evidence of extraordinary intelligence and ambition applied to a project of incomprehensible scale, and the project's incompleteness is baked into the ruins themselves, the mechanism still running, but toward no longer articulable end, the automata still maintaining a civilization that has no one left to benefit from the maintenance. Whatever the Dwemer were building toward, the world they were building it in continued without them. The stones they cut, and the gears they turned, and the pipes they ran through the living rock are still here, still doing approximately what they were built to do, in a world that has no idea what to do with them. The question of Shalador, the ancient archmage who built Labyrinthian, and who is associated in the lore with a level of magical power and knowledge that exceeded anything the College of Winterhold has since produced, is one that the game raises through the Shalador's Insights questline without making fully accessible. Shalador was working on something called the Labyrinthian in the most literal sense, a labyrinth not just as a physical structure, but as a structured system for preserving and transmitting knowledge in a form that would be accessible only to those who could navigate the system. The question of whether the Labyrinthian still functions in this way whether there is knowledge inside it that has not yet been found because the keys to the deeper chambers have not yet been assembled, or because the navigational logic of the structure has not yet been understood well enough, is one that the quest line opens without closing. Shalador's writings, where they survive, suggest a mind operating at a level of abstraction that the scholars who study those writings consistently describe as almost but not quite legible, as if the concepts being expressed are comprehensible individually, but the connections between them exceed the cognitive framework available to the readers. This is either a sign of extraordinary genius or extraordinary obscurity, and the distinction may not matter much if the result is the same. Knowledge preserved in a form that requires a level of understanding to access that exceeds the understanding of everyone who has tried. The College of Winterhold and the Greybeards represent two different but related relationships to knowledge in Skyrim, and the tension between them is one that the game makes implicit through their separate existence rather than through any direct confrontation. The college pursues the understanding of magic through study, experimentation, and the systematic accumulation of theoretical frameworks. The Greybeards pursue understanding through contemplation, through the sustained meditation on the nature of a specific practice across a period of years and decades, allowing depth of understanding to develop where the college pursues breadth. Both approaches have produced remarkable things. Both approaches have left remarkable gaps. The question of what a synthesis of the two would produce, what a scholar with the college's comprehensive library and the Greybeard's contemplative patience and access to Parthenax's thousands of years of accumulated wisdom might eventually arrive at, is one that the game makes available as an imagining without providing any mechanism for it to occur. The two institutions exist in the same province, separated by the breadth of Skyrim's mountains, and the conversation they are not having, the synthesis they are not pursuing, is one of the intellectual mysteries of the Fourth Era's Skyrim. The path up the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar is one of the game's most quietly significant designed experiences, because the ascent through the carved stone markers carries a quality of accumulated time that the markers themselves, each recording a verse of the tongue's history, only partially account for. People have been walking that path for a very long time, pilgrims and scholars and the occasional dragonborn, and the stone of the path carries that passage in the way that stone carries the passage of feet, not as visible where exactly, but as something in the quality of the surface that reflects the weight of all those journeys, without being able to record any of them specifically. The last pilgrim to walk the path before the player character is unknown. The next pilgrim after the player character is unknown. The path persists between pilgrims in a state that is neither the state of being walked nor the state of being abandoned, simply the state of being there, available, waiting with the patience of something that was built to last, and that has not yet been given a reason to doubt that it will. The mysteries of Skyrim have this quality too, the quality of paths between destinations, of the spaces that exist in the middle of journeys, where the departure is behind you and the arrival is not yet visible, and what is available to attention is simply the path itself, the stone and the cold, and the particular quality of light at altitude, and the distance still to go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.